Chapter 152. No matter which world he was in, Han Jin had never had such a flashy experience. The people on the street all turned their attention to them. Their eyes were either stunned or shocked. The former was because of the people, and the latter was because of the magic staff. Han Jin was also quietly observing the magic crystal on the magic staff. In short, the shape was too strange. Was that really a magic staff? No matter how he looked at it, it didn't look like a magic staff. Instead, it looked like a rare weapon, the golden melon hammer. The sight of a beautiful woman walking with a hammer in her hand was somewhat shocking. Under the gaze of countless people, the group kept walking forward. Not to mention the pedestrians. Even the patrols of the Mercenary Association obediently made way for them. They dealt with all kinds of people all year round, so they were very clever. In this day and age, if they really got a magic crystal of the highest quality, they would hide it or put it in their space ring, try not to let anyone know. If they dared to show it off and walk on the street, they either had amazing strength or an unimaginable background. No matter which one it was, they couldn't afford to offend them. "Where are you from?" Leger said to Asa with a smile. "It seems like you're not from around here." In fact, what he said was nonsense. There were no magic academies in the nearby territories. "We are from the elemental capital." Asa didn't hide it. Elemental capital? Leger's expression changed, and his body couldn't help but stop. "Yes. Are you students of the God's Language Magic Academy?" Leger asked again. "The elemental capital seems to only have one magic academy, right?" Asa felt a little funny. No wonder. Leger took a deep breath. Sasu suddenly thought of something. Is she that genius girl? The woman walking at the front suddenly turned around. Her cold eyes swept over Sasu and finally glared at Asa. Asa couldn't help but lower his head and smile bitterly. "You got me into trouble." After that, he quickened his pace and caught up with his companions. Obviously, he didn't want to talk to Leger and the others anymore. They had attracted a lot of attention on the streets, and they were still the center of attention when they arrived at the Mercenary Square. They were even the center of attention when they arrived at the teleportation magic array. Actually, it did not feel good to be in the limelight. Han Jin and the others, as well as the young magicians, felt a little uncomfortable. Only the woman looked indifferent. She was obviously used to it. "Got it." The young man named Irwin ran over. "We can go now." "How much did it cost?" Asa asked. 3,100 gold coins. Moxink's eyebrows twitched involuntarily. A magic scroll that could teleport 30 people back to isolated Cliff City was ridiculously expensive, but these young magicians didn't seem to care about money at all. "Okay." Asa looked at Leger. "Where should we go?" Teleportation Magic Array Number 4. Under the guidance of the guards, the group walked towards Teleportation Magic Array Number 4. Han Jin looked around curiously. The so-called Teleportation Magic Array Number 4 looked like a huge plate, except that the plate was made of countless adamantine stones engraved with runes. Han Jin had a deep impression of this special stone. He had almost broken his head when he tried to use it. Around the Teleportation Magic Array, there were 8 2-meter-tall stone pillars, also engraved with runes. When Han Jin and the others stood in the middle of the plate, the magician in charge of activating the Teleportation Magic Array began to chant loudly. The pillars lit up one by one, and the adamantine stones under their feet became crystal clear. Countless runes seemed to come to life. Then, a faint light curtain appeared out of nowhere and enveloped everyone on the Teleportation Magic Array Number 4. Seeing the light curtain getting brighter and brighter, Han Jin, who had been corrupted by science, suddenly had an idea. What would happen if he stretched one of his legs out of the Teleportation Magic Array Number 4? His body would be in another place, and his leg would be left here? What would happen if he stretched out Morrison's greatsword? However, Han Jin had already understood the power of magic, so he didn't dare to experiment recklessly. These were just thoughts that flashed through his mind. Suddenly, he felt his body become light, as if he was floating. The people around him had all disappeared, and he was surrounded by silence that seeped into the depths of his soul. An indescribable sense of loneliness occupied his mind. Then he saw patches of green, Morrison's, Sunier, and the others. Thinking back, it seemed that it was just his imagination. Is this the Teresham Mountains? Asa and the others looked around curiously. The capital of elements was very far from the Teresham Mountains. They were all children who grew up in the capital of elements, and they didn't have the opportunity to travel to the forest of holy animals. A forest was definitely not a forest. This was something that only those who had been here before could understand. Every year, there would be many rookies who harbored longing and hoped to walk the path of a mercenary. But without exception, the first days of these rookies would always be filled with endless sorrow, suffering, pain, and even fear. There was definitely a huge gap between hope and reality. Some people persevered and became stronger and stronger. Some people, after only one experience, vowed never to set foot in the Teresham Mountains again. And some people, forever swallowed by the endless green. When it came to the danger of the environment, the forest was not inferior to the battlefield. On the battlefield, the enemies could be seen, but here there were invisible dangers everywhere. With so many tall trees, an astronomical number of fallen leaves were produced every year. The fallen leaves couldn't be turned into soil immediately. They always had to go through a long process of decay. In some places, the accumulated fallen leaves were almost a meter deep. When one stepped on them, one's leg would sink deep into the mud. By the time someone helped to pull out the leg would be covered with stinky mud, which was disgusting. Although the Teresham Mountains was a huge forest of holy animals, the most abundant creatures in the forest were not holy animals, but all kinds of small insects such as ants, spiders, and so on. Ants were easy to deal with, as they couldn't cause any disturbance to people walking, but spiders and spider webs were a headache. These rookies didn't think that spiders were anything special. They just needed to avoid them, but spiders weren't as stupid as them. The spider webs they made were always hidden between the leaves, and they couldn't see anything from the outside. When they pushed the leaves aside and walked forward, they bumped into the spider webs. As a result, the screams never stopped. Not only women, but men were also screaming. Suddenly, there was a palm-sized spider on their body. No matter how strong a person's psychological quality was, they couldn't bear it. What's more, some spiders were very aggressive. When a person's head or arm hit the spider web, they would immediately attack. Fortunately, the spiders they encountered were not too poisonous. Fortunately, they brought 2 priests with them. Although they were auxiliary priests, they could always release medical skills. The trouble was not only that. Some grass or leaves looked very soft, but the edges were very sharp. With a light scratch, they could cut a bloody mark on a person's skin. The blood beads were nothing, but the burning pain was extremely unbearable. And after a short time, the bloody mark would swell up. There was also a kind of emerald green frog that was disgusting. After hearing a sound, they would always lie there motionless, waiting for people to come closer. Then, they would suddenly spit out a large amount of green juice. The sticky juice stuck to people's bodies, which was extremely disgusting. There were many other troubles, such as flies the size of gold coins, snakes that could blend in with the surrounding environment, and so on. The previous sense of curiosity soon passed. After walking less than half a mile in the forest, the young magicians were already complaining. In comparison, Hanjin was much calmer. He had experience in the primeval forest, and there were many similarities between the species of the 2 worlds. Although his spirit possession was not enough to fight against strong enemies, it was more than enough to stop these disturbances. Morrisons had only traveled in the outer area of the Teresham Mountains before, and had never set foot in a dangerous place. At first, he could bear it, but later, he could not bear it anymore. He simply pulled out his great sword and slashed wildly to open a path. Sasu and Leger were happy to follow behind Morrisons. As for Sunier, this forest was her hometown. Moreover, she did not walk on the ground. Instead, she flew between the branches like a bird. Gradually, the group became a long snake. Everyone followed behind Morrisons. Not only did they move faster, but they also felt more relaxed. After walking for about a mile, Morrison suddenly stopped and shouted, "I can't go on. Let's take a break." This lousy place is really too hateful. Is this your first time here? Leger asked curiously. Yes. You grew up in isolated Cliff City. How could this be your first time in the Teresham Mountains? How dare you call yourself a mercenary? Leger said in a disdainful tone. Damn it. Before I met Raphael, I was only a sixth-grade swordsman. Why did I come here? Don't want to die. Morrison shouted angrily and anxiously. Then how could I come here? You are a thief. Morrison's felt inexplicably sad. Warriors had always been the most tiring and dangerous profession. Not only did they have to fight at the front, but they also had to work hard to travel. Morrison's and Leger didn't realize that they had made a big mistake by arguing. They had revealed their secret. Morrison's words could be reversed. Before he met Raphael, he was only a sixth-grade swordsman. Was it because he met Raphael that he became a seventh-grade fighter? Of course, only those who were very meticulous would notice this, and they would only have some suspicions. Big guy, if you were tired, you could take a break, a female deacon said sympathetically. Do I need you to tell me that? Morrison's replied angrily. He regretted accepting this mission. The Teresham Mountains were a dangerous place. He had to conserve most of his strength and be ready to deal with any accidents. Also, if there were no outsiders, he could ask Hanjin to come and recover his lost strength immediately. In short, it was very inconvenient right now, so he was very depressed. Chapter 153. I smell water. Sunir's voice came from above. Hold on for a bit longer. We'd better get to the spring and rest. Morrison's raised his head helplessly and asked, How far is it? Not far. We should be able to hear the sound of the spring if we walk a bit further. Morrison's could only pull himself together and continue to lead the way. However, the female magicians and the two deacons were very dissatisfied with Morrison's rudeness and were criticizing Morrison's in a low voice. Asa seemed to have a lot of prestige among the group of young people. He went over and said a few words, and the female magicians immediately became silent. After walking for a short distance, he saw a spring. Although the spring was very narrow, less than 2 meters wide, it was still a small paradise in this gloomy forest. At least, he could see sunlight here, and there was real, tender grass. The female magicians couldn't help but cheer and run upstream, pulling each other. They were all covered in mud and juices of various colors and needed to find a place to wash off. Morrison sat down by the spring and put his giant sword beside him. Sassu and Leger also sat down next to Morrison's. Asa, who was behind them, hesitated for a moment and then walked over to Hanjin. It had only been 2 hours, but their state of mind had undergone a tremendous change. Asa knew that they had come too hastily and had hardly made any preparations. But who could he blame for that? It was the dean who said that they had to leave immediately. No matter how much courage he had, he wouldn't dare to make trouble for the dean of the Magic Academy. Hanjin took out a few pieces of dried meat from his space ring and threw them to Morrison's and the others. He also put a piece of dried meat in his mouth and chewed slowly. Ahem, there's something I don't quite understand. Asa had already walked over. What? Hanjin and the others all looked at Asa. Aren't the teleportation arrays in isolated Cliff City often used? The teleportation circle is a huge source of income for the Mercenary Association. If it wasn't used frequently, what would they eat and drink? Morrison's asked. Then why can't I even find the way here? Has no one ever been here before? Oh, you mean that? Morrison said slowly. The teleportation circle will only teleport people to a certain area. It doesn't have an exact location. It could be on one side of the mountain, on the other side of the mountain, or even on another mountain. How could this be? Asa asked in astonishment. What if someone is teleported into a group of magical beasts? That has happened before, Morrison's replied. What else can we do? If you can't win, then die. This is too irresponsible, Asa said angrily. They are playing with the lives of others. Coming to the forest of magical beasts is an adventure. What are you here for? Morrison said with a faint smile. If you were afraid of risks, then you shouldn't have come. Asa paused, but they could have built a fixed teleportation circle in the forest and sent people to guard it. With the strength of the Mercenary Association, can't they even do that? You're thinking too simply. Simply, it is said that in the beginning, the Mercenary Association did build a few fixed teleportation circles in the forest. However, an accident happened later. What accident? Asa asked curiously. Hanjin and the others were also curious. Although Morrison's had never stepped into the depths of the Terrashaw Mountains, he grew up in isolated Cliff City and naturally knew more than the others. Since the construction of the teleportation circle, it has greatly facilitated the mercenaries. The frequency of them entering and leaving the forest of magical beasts has also increased. Near one of the teleportation circles, there is a pack of gale wolves. For the mercenaries, gale wolves are very good prey. The wolf skin can be used to make leather armor, and the wolf's teeth can be used to make magic swords. If you're lucky, you can even get a few magic crystals. Plus, gale wolves are only 5th grade magical beasts. They are not much of a threat. Morrison's had become the center of everyone's attention. He liked this feeling and slowly told the story. And then, Asa asked, while the others were all listening with great interest. And then, although gale wolves always move in packs, humans are much stronger than magical beasts. Morrison's pointed at his own head. An experienced mercenary has too many ways to deal with gale wolves. Under the constant attacks of the mercenaries, the number of gale wolves decreased rapidly. No one knows when, but a wolf king was born in that pack. A real wolf king. Normal gale wolves are at most 6th grade magical beasts after they evolve, but that wolf king's strength is said to have reached 8th grade or 9th grade. 8th grade or 9th grade shouldn't be that big of a deal, right? Asa said. Why are you in such a hurry? Moxink rolled his eyes at Asa. A few high-grade mercenaries noticed the Wolf King because they knew they could get a mutant magic crystal. But the Wolf King suddenly abandoned its pack and disappeared into the forest. When it reappeared, it had brought back tens of thousands of gale wolves. Asa nodded. That's right. Asa nodded. What? Tens of thousands? Are you kidding? Leger was shocked. With his ability, if he was surrounded by tens of thousands of gale wolves, he would die. Invisibility only hid his figure, but it didn't really make him disappear. If the gale wolves didn't disperse, he wouldn't be able to fly away. Once the effect of invisibility was over, he would be torn to pieces. Plus, wolves had a very keen sense of smell. They would definitely find his location. Kidding? Thousands of mercenaries were torn to pieces by the gale wolves. Do you think I would joke about this? Morrison stared at Asa. That's impossible. Asa shook his head. Mercenaries are much stronger than gale wolves. Tens of thousands of gale wolves can't be a threat to thousands of mercenaries. Are you going to listen or not? If you don't, I'm not going to tell you. Morrison's closed his mouth. Don't. Asa quickly smiled. I'm sorry. I won't interrupt you again. Oomph. Morrison snorted. The Wolf King led the gale wolves to attack the guards of the teleportation circle. Strangely, they didn't destroy the teleportation circle after killing the guards. Instead, they stayed near the teleportation circle. Every time the circle was activated, dozens of mercenaries would be teleported over. Then, the Wolf King would attack again. Maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe the Wolf King really could understand human language. The guards of the teleportation circle were changed every 10 days. The day the Wolf King led the gale wolves to attack the guards was the first day of the change. In the end, all the mercenaries who went through the teleportation circle were killed by the Wolf King. The Mercenary Association didn't find out. Hanjin asked. No. Morrison's shook his head. No. Morrison's shook his head. The mercenaries only go to the Terrashaw Mountains after receiving enough missions. It's normal that they couldn't finish the missions in 10 days. Then how did they find out in the end? Sasu asked. After 10 days, the rotating mercenaries went through the teleportation circle, but the mercenaries who were supposed to come back never came back. This made the Mercenary Association suspicious. They sent more mercenaries, but there was still no news. In the end, a vice president, who was said to be a 10th-level professional, personally led some people through the teleportation circle to find out the reason. In the end, he also disappeared. Sasu and the others couldn't help but gasp. Just by looking at Gerald, They knew how powerful a 10th level professional was. According to Morrison's, the vice president was also killed by the Wolf King. This was no longer a matter of strength, but the madness of the Wolf King. Isolated Cliff City became very chaotic. Some mercenaries said that there was a problem with the teleportation circle and that it was connected to another dimension. But after repeated inspection by magicians, the teleportation circle was normal. In the end, the president of the Mercenary Association, I can't remember his name, he led some senior professionals to the Teresham Mountains through another teleportation circle and then rushed to the location of the incident. Speaking of this, Morrison sighed. 10 days later, they finally approached the teleportation circle. Then they found that it had become a real hell. There were human corpses and wolf corpses everywhere. A tall wolf king with blood-red eyes led tens of thousands of gale wolves to guard the teleportation circle. In the end, the president of the Mercenary Association rushed back to isolated Cliff City and announced to the whole city. He said that this was no longer a hunt or a counter-hunt, but a war waged by the Wolf King against isolated Cliff City. He called on all the mercenaries to take up arms and join the battle. And then, Asa couldn't help but ask, "You just said that if the mercenaries could unite, the Wolf King would be no match for the humans at all." Morrison said, "Then the Wolf King was defeated." However, none of the Gale Wolves escaped. They fought with their king to the last breath. I didn't expect holy beasts to have such intelligence. Asa sighed. There are many things you can't imagine, Morrison said lazily. Actually, holy beasts are not scary. Then what is scary? Humans, elves, and all the other advanced professionals of the intelligent races. They are scary. Morrison said, there are always some small conflicts between mercenaries. If no one guides and controls them, they will eventually turn into hatred. A long time ago, there was a mercenary group. When they learned that the leader of an enemy mercenary group would arrive at the western part of the Teresham Mountains from the teleportation circle the next morning, they set up an ambush near the teleportation circle. When the leader of the enemy mercenary group appeared, they immediately launched an attack and even killed all the guards of the teleportation circle. Later, the Mercenary Association simply dismantled the teleportation circle in the forest and changed it into a one-way circle. The teleportation circle was also changed randomly within a certain area, similar to what it is now. There's such a thing? Why can't they just sit down and talk? Asa asked. Leger and Sasu almost laughed out loud. Morrison's opened his mouth. He was defeated and really didn't know what to say. Because the biggest reason in this world is what kind of power you have. The young principal of the Magic Academy suddenly interrupted. Her eyes swept over Hanjin and the others. Which one of you is Raphael? That's me. Hanjin was surprised. What can I do for you? But the young principal of the Magic Academy turned his eyes away again, completely ignoring Hanjin. Chapter 154. Hanjin and the others could see that the young magicians were exhausted after walking for so long, so they were not in a hurry to set off. Instead, they chatted with each other. Leger, can you still find the nest? Morrison's asked in a low voice. It's just in this area. Let's take our time, Leger replied. Take our time? How long will that take? It was half a year ago. I don't remember much about it. Besides, there are mountains after mountains in this forest, and they all look the same. What can I do? I told you not to take this mission. It's too troublesome. Morrison said. But you didn't say anything. Leger corrected him. I said it in my heart. Can I? You? Leger was speechless. He finally understood how good Morrison's was at arguing. Just then, a scream came from the upper reaches of the spring. The young magicians jumped up and rushed up along the two sides of the spring. However, they were not as fast as the genius magician. The former ran on the ground, while the latter flew in the air. In the blink of an eye, she had left everyone behind. In comparison, Hanjin and the others were much slower. Morrison's lazily grabbed his greatsword. Shall we go and take a look? Asa was the leader of the young magicians, but his experience was very shallow. He did not know how to play word games. The contract clearly stated that Leger's mission was to lead them to the nest of the Hydra and nothing else. In other words, even if all the young magicians died on the way, it had nothing to do with Leger. When they looked at the contract, they could not help but sigh at how black-hearted Leger was. The terms were all beneficial to them. It was hard to understand. In the army, Leger acted like an impeccable gentleman. But after leaving the army, he became a completely different person. Which one was the real Leger? Let's go and take a look. Maybe we can help them, Sunier said. We can help a magus? Morrison chuckled. What an honor. I will remember this. If I have a child in the future, I will tell him that you are not an ordinary warrior. Back in the day, there was a magus who was in a desperate situation and begged. Hanjin and the others were too lazy to continue listening. They left Morrison's, who were immersed in their fantasies, and went upstream. Hey, wait for me. Morrison's woke up from his sweet dream and hurriedly followed behind. In the upper reaches of the spring, 7 or 8 mercenaries were confronting the young magicians. The cause of the matter was very simple. The few female magicians originally just wanted to wash off the mud on their bodies, but no one knew who started it. But after a while, it turned into a bath. Just as they were happily bathing, a group of mercenaries appeared by the spring, and just like that, the situation got out of hand. When a woman encountered such a situation, of course, she would be ashamed and angry. Those female magicians were crying and complaining about their grievances. Their robes were very messy, and each of them was barefoot. There were also many undergarments by the spring. Obviously, they had only put on their robes in a moment of desperation. They were definitely not wearing anything underneath. The male magi were very agitated. They held all kinds of magic staffs in their hands and cursed as if they were competing with each other. If the genius Magus or Asa gave a signal, they would definitely attack. The mercenaries opposite them were very quiet. However, they were exchanging messages with their eyes that outsiders could not understand. 3 warriors stood in front, 2 magi behind them, and 2 archers on both sides. At the very back, there was a warrior holding a giant sword. That sword did not look much worse than Morrison's sword. Their positions were very reasonable, and their expressions were very calm. At first glance, one could tell that they were experienced mercenaries. The young magi were more or less unscrupulous. There was nothing they could do. Who asked them to have a backer? They were not even afraid of a 10th-level magical beast. So why would they be afraid of a few mercenaries? Everyone, you have been cursing for a long time. Shouldn't you listen to us? Can you still be reasonable? The warrior, standing at the very back, said with a smile. It seemed that they had already made a decision. The young magi were even more angry. They were clearly the ones who were at a disadvantage, and the other party was still talking about reason. What a bully. Shut up, all of you. The warrior suddenly roared. Don't be like a group of King ducks, quarreling endlessly. Isn't it annoying? If you want reason, come out one by one. Reason? Asa snorted. You insulted our companions. What reason do you have to talk about? You are saying that you are very reasonable. The warrior looked up and down at Asa. Then let me ask you, do the Teresham Mountains belong to you? What? Asa did not understand. Let me ask you, do the Teresham Mountains belong to you? Nonsense. This forest of magical beasts belongs to you? This time, Asa did not even bother to speak. Since it does not belong to you, we are walking on a free land. What do we do wrong? You insulted our companions. Asa shouted angrily. What a joke, the warrior said. If I take off my pants and pee on the road, then I can accuse the pedestrians of insulting me? Hanjin in the distance suddenly laughed. Morrison's, that guy is comparable to you. What do you mean? Morrison's asked, puzzled. Raphael means that you are very similar to that guy, Sasu said with a smile. Go away. I have never peeked at a woman bathing. We're talking about eloquence. Sasu rolled his eyes at Morrison's. On the other side, Asa's face was red with anger. The warrior opposite him did not let Asa go. He continued to criticize him. The spring water here belongs to everyone. You came here to take a bath and dirty the spring water. We did not say anything, but the young magicians could not help but start cursing again. The warrior's words were drowned in the scolding. The genius sorceress slowly raised her hand. When a young magician saw this, they couldn't help but stop cursing. The genius sorceress said in a cold voice, "It seems that you unrepentant and unreasonable beasts need to be severely punished." Punishment? The warrior showed a contemptuous smile. Then his face suddenly changed. He shouted, "Do it!" A few female magicians who were already in tears suddenly screamed. Two figures appeared beside them without anyone noticing. By the time they realized it, two daggers emitting cold light had already been placed on their necks. The mercenaries on the other side moved at the same time. They slowly moved forward, trying to help their companions. The two thieves controlled the female magicians under their daggers and carefully retreated in different directions. They were probably guarding against a sudden attack so that they would not lose all the hostages at the same time. Ace's expression changed, and so did the genius sorceress. The feeling of not being able to attack the rat for fear of breaking the vases was very depressing. Moreover, they were all sorcerers who had just come out to gain experience, and there was no cooperation between them at all. Even if they gnashed their teeth in anger, they could only watch helplessly. After receiving his companions, the warrior immediately showed a cold smile. Now, who was going to punish who? The noise from before had all disappeared. The magicians remained silent. Hanjin had been observing the genius magus. Seeing that she did not respond, he could not help but feel disappointed. In fact, he had overestimated the genius magus. Because of their different aptitudes, they would progress at different speeds in their pursuit. However, some things could not be compensated by aptitudes. For example, experience, vigilance, and so on. If Guevara and Zagun were here, they would have launched a fierce counterattack or even decided to sacrifice their companions. However, the genius magus would never be able to do that. When the warrior saw that the magicians on the opposite side had become obedient, his heart was relieved. He knew that he had found a flaw. At this moment, he no longer concealed his gaze. He greedily stared at the magic staff in the hands of the genius magician and suddenly shouted, "Put down the magic staff in your hands on the ground." Immediately, the young magicians became restless. They all looked at Asa, waiting for him to make a decision. Asa hesitated for a moment and had no choice but to throw his magic staff on the ground. The other magicians followed suit and threw their magic staffs away. "You." The warrior pointed at the genius magus, but his eyes looked to the other side. He looked at Hanjin and the other two and said, "And you three, throw your weapons on the ground." Sasu looked at the magic staff in his hand and raised his head with a smile. He had no intention of obeying the order at all. Morrison's was even more ruthless. He shouted loudly, "Are you talking to Grandpa?" The warrior was stunned. He was also a smart person and immediately understood the relationship between the two. He said in a deep voice, "Brother, I know it has nothing to do with you, but don't make it difficult for me. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude." "Ha! How can you be rude?" Morrison's university laughed. "You want to bite me?" The soldier sneered and suddenly reached out to grab the hair of one of the hostages and pulled her over. The pitiful female magician screamed and struggled, but she was too weak to do anything. The soldier reached out again and grabbed the little finger of the hostage's right hand. There was a faint crisp sound. The female magician's head jerked up. Her whole face was distorted. Even walking in the forest was tiring. A spoiled flower couldn't bear the pain of having her pinky broken. In just a moment, not only tears but snot also flowed out. Her mouth was so wide open that a fist could be stuffed in it. One could clearly see that her tongue was trembling at a very fast frequency. Then there was an inhuman howl. "Remember, my patience is limited," the warrior said coldly. "I will repeat for the last time. Put down your weapons." Chapter 155. You're an incorrigible idiot. Morrison's chuckled. "Do you know who you're threatening?" "A magus. I'm sure you'll die a horrible death." "Magus?" That warrior clearly stiffened. His gaze swept over the young magicians, and finally, the nervousness and fear in his eyes turned into an insolent smile. "Archmage? Ha ha ha! You guys are too funny. A magus who can't even use magic detection? Huh. The other mercenaries laughed as well. Those super powerful magi who were famous on the continent had all written countless stories filled with bloodshed, intrigue, and death. In other words, they were legends. If there really was a magus here, how could they succeed so easily? Therefore, they didn't believe it at all. Thank you. Thank you for your jokes. The warrior gasped for breath and said in a joking tone, I'm very happy now. Actually, I'm happier than you guys, really. Morrison's gaze fell on Han Jin. Have you seen anyone stupider than this guy? It's a miracle that this guy can live until now. It's not a big deal that he can live until now. It'll be a miracle if he can live until tomorrow, Han Jin said with a smile. All right, that's enough laughing. The warrior's face darkened. He clenched his right hand again. Along with the crisp sound of bones breaking, the female, magus body jumped with all her might like a dying fish. Her heart-wrenching cries spread far and wide in the forest. Put down your weapon, the warrior said coldly. The genius magus bit her lips. In the end, she slowly put down the magic staff in her hand. Her eyes were full of hatred. If she was facing these mercenaries, she would have turned them into ashes long ago. But as the dean of the Magic Academy, she couldn't ignore the safety of her students. She had been high and mighty since she was young. Why had she ever been humiliated like this? Seeing that his goal had been achieved, the soldier smiled proudly. He didn't expect that the magicians would give up their weapons so easily. However, under the current situation, Han Jin and the other two just stood there and didn't do anything, which was very eye-catching. The warrior's hand moved again. He grabbed the female magician's third finger and broke it. This time, the poor female magician didn't even have time to scream before she fainted from the pain. We've already laid down our weapons. Why are you still doing this to her? Asa said angrily. The soldier ignored Asa and stared at Han Jin and the other two. Their calm demeanor made him very uncomfortable. Put down your weapons. Every time I say it, I will break one of her fingers. After that, the warrior grabbed the hair of the unconscious female magician and slapped her twice. The magician beside him then released a water ball. Under the stimulation of the water and the pain, the female magician struggled to open her eyes. The warrior had already grasped the female magician's index finger. Do I have to say it again? The genius magician suddenly turned around and looked at Han Jin and the other two anxiously. Do as he says. If this goes on, Catherine will die. Han Jin smiled. I don't think it was written in the contract, right? The genius magician was speechless. You kill the three of them, the warrior shouted. Otherwise, I'll do it. The young magicians all looked at Han Jin and the others with hostility. It had always been human nature to bully the weak and fear the strong. For them, the enemy mercenaries had taken control of their companions. They couldn't afford to offend them. However, Han Jin and the others were weak because their dean was here. Han Jin and Morrison's looked at each other. They saw the murderous intent in each other's eyes. They didn't want to cause trouble, but the mercenaries had pushed them into a dangerous situation. They had no choice. Morrison's threw his greatsword out. However, he didn't throw it to the ground. Instead, he threw it forward. With a flash of cold light, the greatsword stabbed into the ground a dozen meters in front of the warrior. Morrison's move was so sudden that the warrior was startled. He instinctively shrank behind the female magician. Then he saw that Morrison's didn't attack him. He felt embarrassed and shouted at Sasu, "And you, take a good look at the mountain, the water, and the sky," Han Jin said with a half-smile. The warrior was stunned. What? Because you won't be able to see it anymore. Han Jin's smile suddenly disappeared. Do it. Before he finished speaking, Leger's figure strangely appeared next to a magician. At the same time, the dagger in his hand was stabbed deep into the magician's stomach. The thief and archer beside the magician were shocked. However, before they could do anything, a huge wooden giant appeared out of nowhere and hugged the thief who was about to go invisible. Leger's figure flashed, and the dagger drew a shadow in the air. The dagger deeply cut the thief's throat. Blood splattered everywhere. The archer was just about to draw his bow when he saw the bloody scene. He subconsciously dodged to the side, trying to distance himself from Leger. At this moment, a black arrow flew silently and shot into his left waist. The arrowhead came out from the right side of his waist and pierced through his body. The warrior who was holding the hostage heard the movement behind him and couldn't help but turn around. Han Jin's figure rose in front of him like a ghost. When he turned back, he saw a huge fist coming at him. His sword was still in its scabbard, so he didn't have time to draw it. He could only raise his arm to block the attack while releasing his combat aura. However, Han Jin's movements were too fast. Boom! Before the warrior could raise his arm, Leger's fist landed heavily on the warrior's face. The warrior screamed in pain as he held his face and staggered back. Han Jin had just caught the female magician when a huge fireball came whistling towards him. Han Jin could only push the female magician to the ground and release a wooden giant to block the fireball for her. Galaxy! With a roar, Moxink rushed over and pulled out his huge sword. With an imposing manner, he forcibly stopped the soldiers who were about to go back to help him. Everyone stop! Stop! The remaining thief screamed, or I'll kill her. Morrison's and his opponents quickly separated to the sides. However, Han Jin didn't care and continued to rush towards the magician. The magician moved closer to his companions and released another fireball. Han Jin's figure suddenly sank into the ground. In the next moment, he appeared beside the magician and punched him in the stomach. The magician stiffened and clutched his stomach as he slowly fell to the ground. Han Jin wanted to keep the magician alive, so he only used a little strength. Otherwise, the magician would have already tasted the pain of having his intestines broken. Han Jin smiled and looked to the other side. What did you say just now? All right, put down your weapons. My patience is limited. The situation on the battlefield changed in an instant. Now both sides had hostages. Sasu didn't participate in the battle from beginning to end. He was only 3 meters away from the 2 female deacons. If Han Jin's attack failed, he would take control of the 2 deacons and pave a way out for everyone. The warrior on the other side suppressed the fear in his heart. Only he knew the strength of the dead thief and archer. He was already regretting his greedy actions today. However, the arrow was already knocked on the bow. He had no choice but to shoot. There was no turning back. Stop dreaming. One of your people is also in our hands. If you dare to do anything to him, I can guarantee that this woman will die, the warrior said fiercely. He grabbed the female magician's hair and shook it violently. Although he released his fighting strength in time, Han Jin's fist was not so easy to resist. His nose and mouth were already covered with blood, and a few of his teeth were missing. This made him look even uglier and more ferocious. The female magician screamed, but she only screamed twice before the warrior punched her in the stomach. Suddenly, her whole body curled up like a shrimp. Although she couldn't make a sound, the beads of sweat rolling down her head showed how much pain she was in. Han Jin smiled and stepped on the magician's calf. With a little force, the magician's calf was strangely twisted. Amidst a series of screams, the magician hugged his calf and rolled on the ground. It's your turn. Don't be shy. Han Jin smiled, but his smile now looked like a devil's. The warrior was speechless for a long time. Large beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. It was obvious that the people on the other side were veterans. It could be seen from their thunderous moves that if they didn't care about the female magician's life, he really didn't have the confidence to win in a head-on confrontation. Moreover, there was a high-grade hunter hiding in the forest. What do you want? The warrior forced himself to calm down. But Han Jin didn't answer him. He turned his head and looked at the genius Magus. After a while, he suddenly asked, "Excuse me, but are you really a Magus?" He felt very helpless now. With the strength of the few of them, they could only snatch one hostage in the blink of an eye. The other hostage needed her help. Who would have thought that she would become a spectator, too lazy to even cast a single spell? The genius magician's face suddenly turned red. She was about to speak when she saw Han Jin winking at her. She wasn't sure what Han Jin meant, so she just stared blankly at Han Jin. Han Jin had no choice but to squeeze his eyes again and slowly turn around. "You idiot! Hanjin said to Morrison's without holding back. Who are you talking about? Morrison said angrily. Who else could it be other than you? Hanjin's face was still cold, but his heart was full of admiration. There was no comparison between two people. That genius magus didn't understand what he meant at all, but Moxink was able to react immediately. This was what a true partner should be. Chapter 156. What do you mean? Morrison's asked, his face darkening. If you had come to my aid earlier, I could have saved the hostage. It's all because of you. Do you understand? The failure this time is all on you. Do you think I'm a magician who can teleport? I'm a warrior. Morrison's was so angry that his face turned red. Don't find fault with others for everything. Raphael, let me tell you, I've tolerated you for a long time. Morrison's yelled as he pointed at Hanjin. His thick finger almost poked Hanjin's nose. From today onwards, you can stop tolerating me. Hanjin said calmly. Also, don't point at me. Otherwise, you'll regret it. What can you do about it? Morrison seemed to have shed all pretense of cordiality. Hanjin's eyes flashed coldly. He suddenly punched Morrison's in the face, but Morrison's was already prepared for it. He took a few steps back and dodged Hanjin's attack. He sneered and said, "Settle it with a battle? Good. I like it." Then, he slowly raised his greatsword. The group of young magicians was stunned. After half a day of contact, they had felt that the relationship between Hanjin and the others was very harmonious. They didn't expect that Hanjin would suddenly turn hostile. It was too funny. Stop! Who are you two trying to fool? The warrior shouted angrily. If you dare move again, I'll kill her. Hanjin was stunned. The frost on his face melted quickly. He smiled and said, Morrison's, this guy said we were lying to him. You didn't lie? What failure? Morrison's muttered. He then said angrily, Raphael, you should have given us a signal before you attacked. Why did you attack just like that? Luckily, I've never thought of you as a good person. I've always been on guard against you. The warrior did not know whether to laugh or cry, but only he knew how cold his heart was. Those mages were nothing, but the two mercenaries in front of him did not take him seriously at all. It was natural for them to laugh and scold him, and they even treated him like a child. To do this, one must have 100% confidence as the foundation. Two mercenaries? The warrior was stunned. That's not right. Where did the high-grade rogue go? Regardless of whether Hanjin and Morrison's performance was successful or not, at least they had attracted everyone's attention. In fact, this was what Hanjin wanted. Leger, who had disappeared from everyone's sight. He took the opportunity to cast an invisibility spell and disappeared again. The soldier looked around in panic and then shouted, Be careful. Actually, he should have been careful instead of warning his companions. After all, the hostage was in his hands. Just as he opened his mouth to shout, a dagger appeared out of thin air and pierced his wrist with lightning speed. The dagger was so sharp that when he saw his hand spurt out blood and fall to the ground, he was still in a daze. In the next moment, Leger's figure rushed out and knocked the warrior to the side. He then grabbed the female magician and continued to rush forward. The remaining warriors seemed to have woken up from a dream. They all drew their swords and tried to stop Leger. The rogue immediately turned invisible, and the archer also drew his bow. Leger was in a very bad situation. The hostage was already surrounded. If he rescued the hostage, it was equivalent to sending himself into the encirclement. It was easier said than done to get out safely. If he was alone, Leger would definitely not take the risk. The key was that he had companions that he could entrust his life to. Morrison's moved at the same time and dashed forward. Hanjin's right hand moved like a butterfly among flowers. Two tall wooden puppets appeared on both sides of Leger and protected Leger with their own bodies. Then, Hanjin threw a white light at Morrison's spirit possession spell. But for Moxink, the effect of spirit possession on others was limited because of the lack of self-hypnosis, which was a very important step. But for Moxink, it was enough. He suddenly felt that his body was full of explosive power, and the world around him became extremely clear. He could even see the hairs on the leaves in the distance and the blood streaks in the eyes of the hostile mercenaries. Their speed seemed to have slowed down a bit. Morrison's understood many things in an instant. With this kind of magical magic, he could create one miracle after another. Hanjin had a talisman of Earthmeld in his hand. However, just as he was about to release the talisman, something strange happened. A pure and flawless magic barrier appeared out of nowhere and covered Leger and the female magician. A terrifying bolt of lightning fell from the sky and smashed into the ground with great force, swallowing up the figures. At the same time, a black arrow flew close to the ground and collided with the bolt of lightning. It shattered into countless pieces and splashed in all directions. The last thing people saw was the thief. He had just concealed himself when he was blasted out by the bolt of lightning. In the next moment, he was engulfed by the endless white light. It was as if the whole world had disappeared. All people could see was the roaring and crazy lightning. The deafening sound of explosions came one after another. Every time there was an explosion, countless pieces of broken branches, dirt, and stones would burst out. Moxink steadied himself in a very awkward posture and then retreated in a flurry. Hanjin was also dumbfounded by what he saw. Perhaps people could play with the beauty of the genius sorceress in their hearts. They could laugh at her inexperience, but her power, the magic power that she possessed, absolutely could not be underestimated by anyone. The dancing silver snakes gradually disappeared, and Reg, who was just as shocked, appeared in front of everyone. He looked very obedient, standing straight in the middle of the magic shield, not moving at all. The magician whose leg was broken by Hanjin also stopped howling. He stared blankly at the genius magician. The muscles on his face were distorted. He finally believed that there was really a magister here. But weren't the gods playing a prank on him? A loud cry broke the silence. The female sorceress broke free from Reg's arms and limped towards her companions. Two female deacons and several other female sorcerers came up to her and hugged each other, crying loudly. Asa hurried to the unconscious magician. It turned out that although luck could not be seen or touched, it was really indispensable. The two of them were both hostages, but the former was only punched while the latter's fingers were broken. The difference in treatment was too big. Many professionals had the opportunity to encounter all kinds of dangers. Some of them were able to endure the difficulties, walking further and further, flying higher and higher, while others died halfway. There was also an element of luck in this. Morrison's walked back slowly with his greatsword on his shoulder. He looked at Hanjin, then kicked the useless hostage and muttered, "Brother, close your eyes. It will be quick." The magician was stunned for a moment, then immediately understood. He screamed, "Don't kill me, don't!" The giant sword in Moxink's hand had already chopped down. The sorcerer's screams stopped abruptly. The sorcerer's neck was almost cut off. He scratched helplessly for a while, and then his body went limp and he stopped moving. Leger looked around. The mercenaries were lying on the ground in colorful and strange postures. Hanjin walked over, picked up a sword from the ground, and stabbed each of their vital points. When he pulled out the sword, he would always pick and cut, leaving very long and deep wounds on their bodies. In many stories, legendary heroes had the vitality of cockroaches. As the saying goes, if one survives a great disaster, one is bound to have good fortune later. Heroes would always be enlightened in death and reach new heights. However, Hanjin had completely eliminated the possibility of a hero because he was the one who killed them. We have already saved them. Why do you still want to kill him? The genius magician asked. For some reason, her tone was very soft and not as cold as before. Well, honorable principal, we are different from you. Morrison's replied. It was not easy for him to add the word honorable in front of the title. After all, when he was facing the Dragon Knight Guevara, he was not so restrained. He was probably frightened by the magic and still had lingering fears. How are we different? The genius magician asked. Then she added, My name is Yelena. You can call me by my name. Morrison's directly ignored the second half of the sentence. Honorable principal, after you finish your mission, You will take your students back. But what about us? We still have to live here. I still don't understand. Can you explain it more clearly? The genius magician asked. Who doesn't have her own friends? Morrison's said helplessly. Maybe they're just a small mercenary team, or maybe they are from some mercenary group. If we let him go, he will definitely find his friends and partners to help him get revenge. Yes, Leger added. If they come to us openly, we're not afraid. What we are afraid of is that they're like poisonous snakes waiting for an opportunity to strike. Once we are in trouble, they will hit us when we are down. It is easy to dodge an open attack, but difficult to dodge a hidden arrow, Han Jin concluded. Are you complimenting me? Sunir jumped down from the tree and smiled. But the genius magician paused. But this is not our fault. Honorable principle. Morrison scratched his head. If everyone in the world had a conscience and was reasonable, would there still be killing and plundering? The genius magician was stunned for a moment and whispered, Yes. It reminds me of what you said just now. What did I say? Morrison's was stunned. You said that in this forest, people are more terrifying than magical beasts. The genius magus revealed a smile that seemed to melt ice. I understand. Thank you. Morrison's was stunned. He had never seen such a bright and charming smile. He was completely lost. Chapter 157. After this incident, there was no way for them to continue their journey. Moreover, the young magicians were all in low spirits. In their eyes, this experience was just a vacation. They would hire a mercenary who knew the Hydra's lair as a guide, find the Hydra, and attack it together. If they couldn't defeat the Hydra, their dean would naturally help them. Finally, they would kill the Hydra and return to isolated Cliff City with a magic transmission scroll. Everything was as simple as that. Every step in their imagination contained a lot of details. If there was an accident in every detail, it would be dangerous or even disastrous. The so-called maturity didn't mean that they could accurately predict what was going to happen, but that when an accident happened, they could immediately determine how to solve the crisis. At times like this, there was no time to think carefully. They could only rely on their instincts. Unfortunately, instincts couldn't be learned by learning. They had to go through the tempering of life and death. Moxing found a sandy area in the upper reaches of the spring and spent a lot of effort to build two very simple tents made of twigs, which could barely accommodate a few people. The girls could sleep in the tents today, but the men had to sleep in the open. Fortunately, it was summer now, and the heat would pass after a while. That night, no one could sleep well. Han Jin and the others didn't have any psychological problems at all. The key was the magicians. In comparison, the female magicians were the most unbearable. They tossed and turned until late at night and finally fell asleep, only to be woken up by nightmares. Han Jin realized for the first time that people who had nightmares could scream so horribly. The heart-wrenching screams and the sorrowful cries that sounded like the cries of a 1,000-year-old ghost could give people goosebumps. Normally, after being woken up a few times, people would just ignore everything and go back to sleep, but Han Jin and the others couldn't. There were all kinds of hidden dangers in the forest, and they couldn't relax their vigilance for any reason. Although they had no choice, they still had to check the surroundings every time they were woken up. It was daybreak, and no matter how they rested for the night, they had to continue their journey. The earlier they completed the mission, the earlier they could go home, including Han Jin and the others. No one wanted to stay in the magical beast forest for too long. Morrison's was still in charge of leading the way, and Leger was no longer slacking off like he was yesterday. He and Sunir were on the left and right sides of the team, while Han Jin and Sasu were in charge of bringing up the rear. Although they didn't say it out loud, they had already reached a tacit understanding. The sorcerers looked quite pitiful, so they should help them as much as possible. Of course, it was only a kind of help. Everyone had their own selfish motives. How much one gave depended on how much the other party was willing to give. If he was in danger, would the other party risk his life to save him? If not, then why should he sacrifice himself? Trust wasn't something that could be gained easily. Han Jin and the others had been together for the past year, and they had gone through all kinds of difficulties to build a solid foundation for their friendship. This was more than a year, and how many years could a person live? They had only interacted with the sorcerers for 2 days, and there was no trust or affection to speak of. However, a dramatic scene appeared. Flash leopard. Retreat. Morrison's university roared. In the moment he turned his head to shout and turned his head back, the flash leopard had already fallen into a pool of blood. Then, Morrison's felt a strong wave of magic. Killer bees. It's killer bees. Everyone. Morrison's was only halfway through his shout when a dazzling ball of fire appeared, enveloping the fog-like swarm of bees, the 4-meter-tall hive, and a dozen ancient trees. When the fire disappeared, everything within a few dozen meters had turned into ashes. Nothing was left. Giant eagle. Be careful, it's treating us as food. A bolt of lightning fell, and the giant eagle, which made Morrison's nervous, was cut in half by the lightning. The two halves rolled among the leaves and fell to the ground. After repeating this several times, Morrison's felt very embarrassed. There was a top-grade magus in the team. What was the point of him yelling and jumping up and down? Wasn't he just like a clown? Genius Magus Yelena's attitude had undergone a drastic change. In the past, she was like an iceberg, quietly following the team because her responsibility was to supervise and protect. She believed that she should only intervene when the situation was extremely bad. Now, she had become a top bow. As long as she saw something threatening, she would attack first, not giving the students a chance to practice. What was even more hilarious was that when they encountered 2 other mercenary teams, Yelena would immediately release a magic barrier to protect everyone in the team. In such a tense situation, she did not forget to protect others, which was worthy of praise. However, she then prepared to release offensive magic. One of the mercenary teams sensed the violent magic waves that were enough to change the color of the sky and was scared witless. They thought that they had encountered a mercenary team that specialized in killing others, so they immediately scattered and fled into the depths of the forest. The other mercenary team was not easy to deal with. They immediately prepared for battle. The thieves went invisible. The archers sneaked into the forest, the magicians released their shields, and the warriors released their combat power. Morrison's jumped in the middle and waved his hand desperately to stop Yelena's impulse. After that, Morrison's threw down his giant sword to show that he was a peacemaker. He then walked towards the mercenary team and sincerely apologized. He explained that they were a newly formed mercenary team that was attacked by another mercenary team in the forest a few days ago. Therefore, they were still a bit emotional. The leader of the mercenary team was a reasonable person. After hearing about Morrison's experience, he expressed deep sympathy. Then, the two of them had a heated conversation. They deeply criticized some of the bad practices among mercenaries and condemned the inaction of the Mercenary Association. After exchanging names, Morrison's learned that the mercenary team in front of him was the Reaper mercenary team. Whether it was strength, income, or fame, the Reaper mercenary team was above the Red Vanguards. They were definitely in the top 3 of all the mercenary teams in isolated Cliff City. If they met in the forest under normal circumstances, the other party would not even bother to talk to Morrison's. However, because of Yelena's extraordinary strength, Morrison's, who used her power to intimidate others, received a lot of respect. The other party even left their address and asked Morrison's to have a few drinks with them when he returned. In the end, the two parties waved goodbye in a warm and friendly atmosphere. Morrison's, who had returned happily, saw Yelena, and his facial muscles could not help but twitch. Danger! If Yelena released her magic, it would be a fight to the death. Maybe Yelena could save her own life, but what about the others? How could they escape the Reaper mercenary team's pursuit? For 10 whole days, they had been wandering in the forest. Except for this incident, there was nothing special. As for how many magic beasts they had encountered with Yelena around, everything seemed so ordinary. She could turn them into ashes with a wave of her hand. That was all. However, they had to admit that they had gained a lot because it was written in the contract that all the gains would be divided equally between the two parties. Yelena's strength was, of course, much stronger than the armored bulls they had used before. In addition, they were in the Teresham Mountains, so the magic crystals they gained every day were much more than before. Because of this, Hanjin and the others began to suspect that Leger was doing this on purpose. Hanjin and Morrison's also seriously found an opportunity to ask Leger out for a long talk. In the end, Leger swore that he had no intention of using those magicians. Indeed, they could not find anything that matched their impression of him. On this day, the road became more and more difficult to walk. Moxing's forehead was covered with a layer of fine sweat. It was easy to chop off the branches blocking the road, but the thick rattans that could be seen everywhere could not be cut off without more strength. Wait a minute. Something is wrong. Sunir suddenly jumped down from the tree. What's wrong? Hanjin went up to her. Didn't you notice? There are fewer and fewer low-level magic beasts. I suspect that there's a big guy nearby. As Sunir spoke, a pair of pointed ears stuck out from her long blonde hair, moved a few times to capture the sound around her. Yelena paused for a moment and nodded. That's right. How could there be other low-level magic beasts near the Hydra's nest? Who did you hear this from? Morrison's asked. His question was worth discussing because he was not asking how she knew. Obviously, he was sure that the genius magician in front of him could not have had any complicated experience. Do I need to hear this from others? Just think about it. Hanjin and the others looked at Leger. They had never dealt with the Hydra before, so they did not know its habits or the situation near its nest. However, they knew that nothing could be understood just by thinking about it. We're here? Asa and the others were all excited and quickly caught up with them. Yes, it shouldn't be far. Be careful, Yelena said softly. The young magicians were very excited and said, Don't worry, we'll be fine. Thank you for your concern. Morrison's secretly curled his lips. If it weren't for Yelena, these students would not even be enough to fill the gaps between the Hydra's teeth. Leger was the most puzzled. He clearly remembered that there were all kinds of magical beasts in the Hydra lair the last time they found it. The only one they didn't find was a super-ranked magical beast like the Hydra. But, judging from their conversation, could there really be a big guy here? However, even though he was puzzled, he still had to walk. Under Sunir's instructions, Morrison slowed down a lot. He was even ready to run to Hanjin as soon as he sensed anything strange. Just as everyone was moving forward cautiously, a giant eagle flew through the air. But just as the giant eagle flew over them, a low roar suddenly came from the depths of the forest. The giant eagle seemed to have hit an invisible wall, and it was instantly uprooted. It let out a panicked cry as it flew into the distance. Following the roar, everyone felt as if a sledgehammer had hit their chests. Hanjin and the others were fine, but the female magicians in the team were already pale and seemed to be unable to stand properly. Just the sound alone was so terrifying. How powerful was the magic beast? The genius sorceress exclaimed in surprise, and her expression became serious. Chapter 158. Hanjin and the others looked at each other. Before they could decide whether they should go or not, the ground suddenly shook. Then, crazy roars, muffled crashing sounds, and violent magic waves came from afar. The trees around them were all shaken to the point of rustling. What's going on over there? Asa asked in surprise. Don't wander off. Leger's figure flashed and disappeared into the dense forest. Don't bother. Yelena frowned and released her clairvoyant's eyes. The first two clairvoyant's eyes were not in the right position. When the third clairvoyant's eyes was released, a shocking scene appeared in front of everyone. Two holy beasts were engaged in a life-and-death battle. Those who had never seen them would not be able to imagine how huge they were. For example, Sunir had to jump between the branches several times before she could reach the top of the ancient tree, but the two holy beasts could reach the same height as the ancient tree if they stretched their necks. The two magical beasts both had fat bellies. Their lower bodies were similar to lizards, but their upper bodies were very different. One of them had several heads and a very long neck, even longer than its body. It moved abnormally fast, just like a spirit snake. Its whole body was greenish-gray and emitted a faint phosphorescent light. The other holy beast body was a size smaller, of course, only compared to its opponent. However, its head was much larger than its opponent's, but unfortunately, it only had one head. In the crazy collisions and biting, it was obviously at a disadvantage. Whenever it was in danger, it would spit out a thick flame from its mouth to save itself from danger. Although they were far away from the battlefield, they could still feel the fierceness of the battle and the strength of the two holy animals. No matter if it was hard rocks or tall trees, nothing could withstand their tussle. Sand and stones were flying everywhere, and branches and leaves were falling down. It had only been a short time since the battle started, but the two holy animals had already raised the surrounding dozens of meters to the ground. In the battle, the holy beast with several heads could easily take the initiative, but it was very afraid of the flames released by its opponent. As soon as the flames flashed, it would retreat in panic. Sometimes it could not retreat in time and was hit by the flames. It could be clearly seen that all its heads were trembling violently, and some were even twisted into a ball. Obviously, it was in great pain. Hydra? A dragon? Moxink's eyes almost popped out of his eye sockets. It's not a dragon. It's a half-grown baby dragon, Yelena said softly. How pitiful. The young magicians were in an uproar and almost applauded. For them, these days were like hell. Now that they saw the Hydra, they could finally go home. As for whether they can kill Hydra, they are not worried at all. Morrisons and the others looked at each other. They could see the joy in each other's eyes. After all the loot would be divided equally. The key was that dragon. Although it was only a young dragon, its skin could be used to create top-tier armor. Its blood was an extremely rare alchemy ingredient. Its bones could be used to create a large number of magic arrows. If they met a good customer, such as an undead mage, a complete set of dragon bones could be sold for an astronomical price. Most importantly, they might even be able to obtain a dragon crystal. Realistically speaking, if they could obtain that dragon, they would not need to do anything else for the rest of their lives. It would be enough for them to live happily ever after. I've only heard of people who encountered such things and suddenly became rich. I didn't expect such good luck to come to us today. Morrisons laughed. Principal, shall we go now? Asa rubbed his hands excitedly. No, now is not the time, Sunir said. The battle between the two magical beasts became more and more intense. They wrestled from the hillside to the foot of the hill, and then from the foot of the hill to the next. Everywhere they went, there was a mess. In fact, hydras were very low ranked among the top magical beasts. One reason was that they were too heavy, and the other was that they did not have any special abilities. They could only spit out some acid to corrode their opponents. If all the magical beasts living in an area were top magical beasts, hydras could only be obedient with their tails between their legs. However, that dragon was still a young dragon. Even its dragon scales were not fully grown. Furthermore, the dragon's proficiency in dragon language magic was not unlimited. Gradually, the number of times it used magic became less and less. On the other hand, the attacks of the Hydra became more and more fierce. Finally, the Hydra seized the opportunity. A few of its heads spat out acid mist from above, attracting the attention of the baby dragon, while the other heads stretched out to the baby dragon's abdomen, biting it hard and dragging it forcefully. The baby dragon was dragged with its belly facing the sky. Naturally, the baby dragon was not willing to wait for its death. It opened its mouth and bit one of the Hydra's heads. The intense pain made the Hydra even more crazy. The remaining heads bit on the young dragon's abdomen with all their might. Pieces of flesh and blood flew everywhere. In the blink of an eye, a few bloody holes were torn into the young dragon's abdomen. However, the young dragon was in more pain, so it became even crazier. Not only did it not let go, but it also shook violently, trying to bite off one of the heads of the Hydra. Let's go. Sunir felt that it was time. The road to the battlefield was not long. It was only a few miles, but it was very difficult to walk. However, this was not a problem for the people who had fallen into a frenzy. There was no need for Morrisons to pave the way. The magicians were all running forward with all their might. It could even be said that they were rolling and crawling. When they arrived at the battlefield, the battle was already over. One of the heads of the Hydra was hanging limply on the ground, and the young dragon's chest was cut open, revealing a bloody mess of internal organs. Seeing a group of crazy people rushing out from the forest, the Hydra immediately roared to warn all the uninvited guests. However, Asa and the others did not care. They all began to cast spells. Lightning, fireballs, wind blades, and other spells rained down on the Hydra. There were even small fireballs. The two deacons were also casting healing spells, not caring whether their companions were injured or not. The Hydra clearly felt the hostility and rushed over with large strides. All kinds of spells fell on its body, but none of them had any effect. Although the Hydra was said to be slow, and its 2 legs were ridiculously short, everything was relative. The former was compared to other top-grade holy animals, while the latter was compared to its body length. In fact, the Hydra's 2 thick legs were 3 meters tall, and its huge body could be described as a giant. When it ran, it gave off a feeling that the earth was shaking and the mountains were shaking, making it hard for people to breathe. The faces of the young mages changed, and they hurriedly began to cast restraining spells, trying to block the Hydra with earth wall and firewall. Unfortunately, with their magic power, the effect of the spells they cast was not optimistic. The firewall and dragon breath were worlds apart. The Hydra was immune to such spells, and the earth wall was not as tall as the Hydra's legs, so it was even less effective. Roar! The Hydra roared again. The closer it was, the more shocking it was. People had to raise their heads to see the ferocious snake heads. Yelena had finished chanting her spell. She raised her magic staff forward, and a dazzling bolt of lightning shot out. It fell on the Hydra's body and turned into countless electric arcs that flowed out. Finally, it formed a giant net that firmly wrapped the Hydra in it. The Hydra's body stiffened, and then it fell to the ground with a bang. Its immeasurable weight was like an exploding cannonball, raising a cloud of smoke and dust. The Hydra struggled frantically, but the giant net made of lightning seemed to be elastic. No matter how the Hydra twisted, it could not break free from the lightning. Yelena heaved a sigh of relief, and then began chanting another spell. At this moment, an unexpected accident happened. The young magician closest to Yelena suddenly stabbed at her with his magic staff. At the end of the staff, there was a shiny blade. Yelena trusted her students and loved them. She had never thought that the attack would come from behind her. Moreover, a magician's reaction speed was not as fast as a warrior's. In her moment of shock, the sharp blade had pierced deeply into her back. "Warwick, are you crazy?" Asa roared with his eyes wide open. Yelena staggered. Suddenly, a flash of light shot out from her magic staff, and a bolt of lightning struck the attacking magician at close range. The power of the lightning released by a magus was unimaginable. The magician screamed in pain and was sent flying. Yelena struggled to turn around and look at her good student. Suddenly, a faint shadow appeared beside Yelena and swung a dagger at Yelena's neck at lightning speed. The first assassination was an accident, and the second assassination was even more unexpected. Yelena was still wondering why her student attacked her, and she didn't expect there to be another assassin. Although she had learned her lesson last time, in this situation, she couldn't use magic detection to look for possible thieves. However, at this time, Hanjin and Sunir both reacted. Just now, they were so focused on admiring Yelena's magic that they let their guard down. When the shadow appeared, Hanjin had already released a wooden golem. However, the opponent's attack was too fast, and he couldn't block it in time. He could only control the wooden golem to knock Yelena to the side. The dagger slashed Yelena's neck and blood splattered. The shadow didn't look at whether Yelena was dead or alive, turned around and fled. Yelena swayed and fell down. As she fell, a magic scroll quietly floated out and turned into a giant bolt of lightning, chasing after the assassin. If the lightning released by Yelena just now was as thick as a person's arm, then this one was a lightning pillar. The shadow was hit directly, and his whole body was sent flying. He hit a rock and stuck to it for a moment, then slowly slid down. Blood flowed out of the corner of his mouth and nose. Sunir had already drawn her longbow. Just as she was about to shoot an arrow, she suddenly saw a ray of black light from the corner of her eye. The speed of the black light was indescribably fast, even exceeding the limit of human reaction. However, Sunir's experience of life and death had already made her instincts. She subconsciously leaned to one side, and a powerful arrow shot into her shoulder and pierced through her body. With a thud, Sunir was nailed to a tree trunk. In a duel between archers, whoever was in the dark had the upper hand. Sunir had killed many archers from the enemy camp, but today, it was her turn to be killed. At the same time, Leger appeared in front of the assassin and stabbed his dagger into the assassin's chest. In that split second, there was no time to analyze the opponent's strength. After Leger made his move, he realized that he had chosen the wrong position. The strength of the assassin's body was far beyond his expectations. Of course, the assassin also didn't expect to receive such a fatal blow. An ominous glint flashed in the assassin's eyes. He grabbed Leger's wrist with such force that Leger felt as if his hand was being held in place by an iron band. He couldn't move at all. Then, the dagger went straight for Leger's chest. Leger reacted quickly and grabbed the assassin's wrist. After a moment of stalemate, victory was decided. He could only watch as the dagger inched closer and closer to his chest. In his panic, Leger struggled with his right hand, trying to inflict more damage with his dagger while desperately dodging. Ah! The assassin roared and pushed forward with all his strength. Leger's dagger went a few inches deep into the assassin's body. The tip of the dagger even penetrated the assassin's body and pressed against the rock behind him. The distance between the two was naturally reduced by a few inches. Then, the assassin used all his strength to stab at Leger's chest. Leger used all his strength to move back and avoid being hit in his vitals. The dagger only left a deep wound under his ribs. In the twinkling of an eye, both the assassin and the victim had paid a great price. Han Jin and the others were here to reap the fruits of their labor, but none of them had expected that their encounter would be even more tragic than the fight between holy animals. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chijian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 159. When Sunir was hit by the arrow, Morrisons quickly stood in front of Sunir. Sasu immediately released a magic shield, covering all three of them, and then cast a magic shield on himself. Han Jin looked ahead quietly. Although he had already cast spirit possession, the situation had changed too quickly. First, Sunir was hit, and when he looked at Sunir, Leger was also injured. He really had no ability to support anyone. The battle between Leger and the assassin was coming to an end. The assassin was first seriously injured by Yelena's scroll, then pierced through by Leger's dagger. He was like an arrow at the end of its flight. Under such circumstances, the assassin was still able to injure Leger. It could only be said that his strength was too strong. At this time, a faint cry of sorrow came from the forest. Han Jin's expression suddenly changed. With a flick of his wrist, a wooden golem appeared beside Leger out of thin air. At the same time, a black light shot out from the forest and hit the wooden golem. Leger immediately reacted. He covered his wound and staggered back a few steps. Then, he activated invisibility and disappeared into thin air. Han Jin silently observed the forest. Although the archer had already launched 2 attacks, he still couldn't find his hiding place. Morrisons and the others didn't dare to move. Looking at the speed of the arrow, which was even faster than Sunir's arrow, they could only firmly guard Sunir and vigilantly observe the surroundings. Ace's students didn't understand the horror of their opponent. They surrounded Yelena with sorrowful faces, and various cries came from their mouths. Fortunately, the enemy didn't care about them and didn't attack them. The genius sorceress was covered in blood and lying on the ground without a sound. No one knew whether she was dead or not. After a moment, Han Jin suddenly snorted coldly. The wooden puppet used to save Leger moved and punched the assassin. The assassin was only on the verge of death and still had a few breaths of life left. After being punched by the wooden puppet, blood immediately gushed out from his mouth and nose. The wooden golem did not stop and continued to punch the assassin. The muffled thuds sounded exceptionally cruel in the silent forest. The assassin did not even have the strength to vomit blood. He could no longer stand and fell to the ground. However, the wooden golem did not let the assassin go. Every time its fist landed, the assassin's body would twitch. Finally, the archer in the forest couldn't take it anymore. A hoarse voice rang out, "All of you will die." A streak of black light shot out from the forest and hit the wooden golem's head. However, the wooden golem was not a normal human. Even after being hit in the head, it did not affect its ability to move. It was still seriously punching the assassin's body. The archer in the forest paused for a moment. Then, the concentrated sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out. Several arrows whizzed out from the forest almost at the same time, hitting the wooden golem's joints one after another. These arrows were all enchanted. They did not simply pierce through the wooden golem. Instead, they exploded on the wooden golem. In the blink of an eye, the wooden golem's 2 arms were blown off. Han Jin finally found the archer's position. He moved at the same time and rushed straight forward. However, after just 2 steps, he suddenly stopped. In front of the archer, a magician in a purple robe suddenly appeared. The magician was about 30 years old and had a baby face. He looked very easygoing, but Han Jin smelled a very dangerous aura. "Why are you so late?" the archer said in a hoarse voice. "Daisy, what do you mean?" The magician frowned. "You said that I couldn't hide my elemental aura in front of Yelena and didn't let me follow her. Now you're blaming me? I sensed your signal and came here immediately. How fast do you want me to go?" But the archer paused. Recalling the battle scene, she couldn't blame her companions. It was too fast. The battle was almost over in the blink of an eye. But Upton, he already know. The magician's eyes fell on Han Jin. It was this puppet master who did it, right? Don't kill him so easily. The archer gnashed her teeth. "I want to torture him bit by bit. You will get what you want." The magician paused. "Actually, leaving Mr. Upton is not a bad choice for you. Don't be too sad." The magician did what he said. There was no trace of sadness on his face. On the contrary, there was a happy smile on his face. "Terrence," the archer roared. Okay, pretend I didn't say anything." The magician smiled and slowly walked out of the forest. The archer coldly looked at her companion's back and then turned her eyes to the other side. Morrison suddenly stopped and slowly stepped back. He wanted to help Han Jin, but compared to him, Sunir was in more danger. If the archer continued to attack Sunir, he was afraid that Sasu wouldn't be able to handle it alone. "Let me introduce myself. My name is Terrence." The magician smiled at Han Jin. Then he paused for a moment and raised his wand. A white ice ring with him as the center quickly rolled down. Leger was swept out by the ice ring, but his reaction was just as fast. He somersaulted out of the range of the ice ring and disappeared into the air. "You'd better stay away from me, thief." The magician named Terrence smiled. "You should know that it is very dangerous to challenge someone of a higher level. Our great Mr. Upton is a good example, isn't he?" Han Jin's body began to move. He directly rushed towards Terrence. In terms of long-range attack, he couldn't compare with a magician. He had to take the initiative. "You overestimate yourself." Terrence sneered and raised his wand. Clouds of white mist appeared around Han Jin and quickly moved towards Han Jin. Han Jin suddenly felt the air become very cold. The thick mist stuck to his body and turned into bright ice crystals. There were more and more ice crystals, and they were getting thicker and thicker. Han Jin's body shrunk. Just like Leger, he silently disappeared. Terrence was stunned for a moment. Then, Han Jin rose from behind him and punched him in the back. Boom! When Han Jin's fist was about to hit the target, small mirror-like objects suddenly appeared on Terrence's body. It was Terrence's ice armor. However, Hanjin's strength was very strong. He broke the ice armor, and the tip of his fist finally touched Terrence's shoulder. Hanjin certainly wouldn't change his target. Terrence's shoulder was not a vital part of his body. At this critical moment, Terrence suddenly turned his body sideways and stabbed backwards with his wand. For the first time, neither of them had the upper hand. Terrence staggered forward a few steps, while Hanjin let out a muffled groan. Terrence looked at Hanjin in surprise. "You're a puppet master? You're a magician?" Hanjin asked tit for tat. Terrence's strength was very strong. His chest was still aching. He had cast spirit possession, and his body had become very strong. Just the wand alone was enough to make him feel pain. What if it was a knife? "I forgot to introduce myself." Terrence smiled and moved his shoulder. Obviously, he didn't feel good after taking that punch. "I'm a battle magician, a pure battle magician." "Then I'm a battle puppet master," Hanjin said calmly. "Interesting." Terrence chuckled and began to chant a spell. Hanjin's figure shot forward like a bolt of lightning. The distance between the two was already very close. In the blink of an eye, he had closed in on Terrence. Terrence took a step back and gently waved his wand. A somewhat turbid, semicircular ice wall appeared and firmly enveloped Terrence. A mirror-like layer of ice also appeared under his feet. Clearly, this was to prevent Hanjin from burrowing out of the ground and attacking him again. Hanjin punched the ice wall with his fists. Countless cracks appeared on the ice wall where Hanjin's fists landed. Hanjin took a deep breath and punched out alternately with his fists, leaving one afterimage after another in the air. His fists fell on the ice wall like raindrops, shattering countless ice chips and splashing all over the place. Even his hair was covered with ice chips. Terrence finally finished chanting his spell. With the movement of his wand, snowflakes appeared in the sultry forest. Then one, then dozens, and finally countless snowflakes floated down from the sky. Looking from the outside, even Hanjin and Terrence's figures could not be seen clearly. The snowflakes did not fall to the ground. Instead, they danced and spun around Terrence like living fairies, sparkling and beautiful. However, Hanjin could not see anything. He could only close his eyes. The countless snowflakes were like countless lethal weapons. They circled around him, trying to cut his body. Before he closed his eyes, he saw countless small tears on his sleeves. The ice wall that Terrence had cast suddenly cracked open. A white snowball flew out and hit Hanjin. Hanjin staggered back a dozen steps before he could stabilize himself. Then, he heard Terrence's arrogant laughter. "Battle puppet master? No one has been able to fight against me while I'm protected by my blizzard protection. Come, let me see how you fight. Don't worry about me. Go help Raphael." Sunir gritted her teeth. The arrow had damaged her internal organs, so she could not help but cough softly. Every time she coughed, blood would flow out from her nose and mouth. Morrisons and Sasu did not dare to touch the arrow. They were not priests. The only person who could save Sunir was Raphael. Morrisons hesitated for a moment. At this moment, the archer in the distance seemed to have noticed their intentions. He raised his hand and shot an arrow. The arrow whistled through the air and flew straight towards Sunir. Morrisons rushed forward and blocked the arrow with his greatsword. With a boom, a ball of fire exploded on Morrison's greatsword. He took a few steps back and almost bumped into Sunir. Sasu and Morrisons looked at each other. Their hearts sank. If Morrisons left, Sasu would not be able to protect Sunir. "Go," Sunir said angrily. "Go help Raphael." Morrisons did not know what to say. "Are you going or not?" Sunir suddenly grabbed the arrow. "No, Sunir, please don't." Morrison's face turned pale. At this moment, a deafening roar sounded. It was the Hydra. No matter what kind of magic it was, it would disappear eventually. The lightning net was getting dimmer and dimmer. Terrence's laughter became more and more rampant. "It seems that you have to knock me down as soon as possible. Otherwise, Hydra will kill all of you without me doing anything." Chapter 160. Hanjin roared and dashed forward. Now, Morrisons and Sasu were pinned down, and Leger could not hurt Terence, who was protected by the blizzard protection. The young magicians were not reliable at all. All the burden was on Terence's shoulders. Terence grinned and fearlessly faced Han Jin head-on. Although he was not as strong and fast as Han Jin, he could cast spells at any time and place. The ice ring slowed down Han Jin's speed, and the icicle was extremely lethal. When he was attacked, he could cast Ice Wall and Ice Armor, which greatly increased his defense. He could even use his wand to fight with Han Jin. There was also a layer of hard ice that moved with his body. A professional with rich combat experience would not give his enemy the same chance twice. He was always on guard against Han Jin's strange magic. No matter what, Terence had the upper hand. Han Jin's speed was getting slower and slower. Terence took the opportunity and cast 3 ice rings in succession, almost turning Han Jin into an Iceman. Then, a huge icicle appeared in his hand and whistled towards Han Jin's chest. Han Jin used the last of his strength to take a step back, and then his body shrank into the ground. The next moment, he appeared dozens of meters away, far away from the blizzard protection. Huh. Terence laughed wildly. You gave up just like that? What a disappointment. At this moment, the young magicians suddenly started arguing. A male magician kicked Asa to the ground, then grabbed a magic scroll and was about to release it. With a flash of dark light, a powerful arrow shot out, and the impact of the arrow tore the magic scroll into countless pieces. Then, the next arrow accurately pierced the male magician's throat. He waved his arms and fell to the ground. The young magicians all looked desperate. They had been arguing with each other, and some of them had insisted on releasing the space scroll and returning to isolated Cliff City. However, Asa had refused. He did not be a deserter. Even if he wanted to escape, he wanted to take the guides with him. It was clear that the assassins were here for Dean Yelena, and the mercenaries were fighting to the death to protect them. He couldn't do such a despicable thing. At this moment of life and death, the prestige that Asa had accumulated over the years seemed to pale in comparison. A few mages who were bent on escaping actually used violence to snatch the magic scrolls. Unfortunately, they had overlooked the cruelty and meticulousness of the enemy. However, Han Jin was not in the mood to care about what was happening behind him. His eyes swept over the arrogant Terence, the sneering archer, and the hydra that might break free from the electric net in 1 or 10 minutes. Suddenly, Han Jin smiled, and his smile was very relaxed. Han Jin cast a charm of spirit refreshment on himself and tidied up his tattered and messy robe. To be honest, he was very afraid of death, so he was also very selfish. Morrison's had begged him to cast a substitute puppet spell on himself, but Han Jin had always rejected Morrison's because the first thing that Han Jin had to consider was his own safety. That day, he had rushed into Black Raven City alone and killed everyone. In the eyes of others, he was a fearless warrior, but if it were not for the protection of the faked Earth corpse, he would never have gone in. Reputation meant nothing to him, but the world was so strange. Or perhaps God was so heartless. Whatever he feared, it would happen. Of course, he could use the Earth Meld to escape far away, regardless of the life or death of anyone. But the question was, could he really do that? Asa did not want to leave earlier because he had his own conscience. But now, Han Jin could not leave because he had already regarded Morrison's and Sasu as his true friends. In fact, it was not easy to be a fearless deserter. He had to abandon everything that he once thought was beautiful, have the courage to bear the curses of the world, and be prepared to live a life of complete isolation. Come to think of it, this was even more difficult than death. From now on, no one would care about his happiness, anger, sorrow, or joy. He would be mocked, rolled his eyes, and even ostracized from society. Living in such a situation was torture. Han Jin turned back to look at Morrison's. His eyes were bright and spirited, and his smile was clear and bright. At this moment, Han Jin no longer looked like a warrior bathed in blood. Instead, he looked like a young man holding a bouquet of flowers, standing at the entrance of the village, ready to welcome his lover. Morrison's and Sasu could not help but stare blankly. They had known Han Jin for more than a year, and they had never seen Han Jin smile so happily. Could it be that he already had the confidence to win? No, Raphael, don't. Sunir suddenly cried out. Some women's intuition was frighteningly sharp, and Sunir was one of the best. Moreover, at least half of her heart was devoted to Han Jin. Although she could not explain the reason, she knew that Han Jin's smile was not a good thing. And those eyes that were full of warmth clearly had a sense of farewell. Still not giving up? Terence sneered. Han Jin turned around and looked at Terence. He said softly, "Come with me." What? Terence did not understand and asked subconsciously. Huh? Han Jin let out a clear laugh. He was really relaxed now. It was like a person standing at the edge of a cliff. The most difficult thing was to decide whether or not to take that step. Pain, reluctance, hesitation, and so on were all tormenting and testing a person's will. But when it was time to jump, all of these worries no longer existed, and there was no need for them to exist. Han Jin had already formed a sword seal and shouted, "Go!" The scabbard at Han Jin's waist trembled violently. Then, a bright sword light suddenly exploded, twisting the scabbard into pieces. It used to be an ordinary long sword, but in Han Jin's hands, it blossomed with a peerless brilliance. It was like a dragon that was born in the wilderness. It was incomparably light and carried a supreme majesty. Every 10 meters or so, it would explode with a fireworks-like tail flame composed purely of flowing light. In the eyes of outsiders, this was a manifestation of elemental energy overflowing. However, Han Jin knew that every time a tail flame exploded, it represented the dissipation of a talisman that had exhausted its spiritual energy. Han Jin had spent a lot of effort on this sword because his realm was not high enough to use a flying sword. When he was free, he would add nearly 100 talismans to the flying sword. When he was busy, he would try his best to squeeze out a few more talismans. Up until now, he had already lost count of how many talismans he had added. He only knew that when the talismans burned out, his life would also come to an end. When he was in the Westbite Man City, he had almost used the flying sword to deal with Gerald. Fortunately, the sudden appearance of the vampire had helped him a lot. Unfortunately, he could only help himself now. The flying sword broke into the snow wind protection barrier. In such a short distance, it had already used up 3 talismans, leaving a tail flame that was more than 10 meters long behind it. Those headache-inducing snowflakes had no effect on the flying sword. The dazzling sword light firmly locked onto Terence's body. Terence's expression became serious. He raised his hand and released an ice wall. He didn't expect to use the ice wall to block the strange longsword. He only wanted to test the strength of his opponent's magic. Han Jin sneered. The flying sword flew up in an incomparably agile manner, floating over the ice wall and continuing to approach Terence. Terence hurriedly added another ice wall, firmly blocking himself inside. The flying sword shot forward and lightly scratched the ice wall like a dragonfly, skimming the surface of the water. With a loud explosion, the ice wall turned into countless fragments and shot out in all directions. At the same time, the flying sword also burst into a huge ball of flame. Then, the flying sword shot downwards like lightning. Terence's expression changed. When the flying sword was about to hit his chest, his figure suddenly disappeared. In the next moment, he reappeared dozens of meters away. Teleportation. This type of spatial magic was similar to Han Jin's Earth Meld. However, while Han Jin could use Earth Meld without limit, this type of magic had a corresponding cooldown. Terence could only move his body, but he couldn't bring the snow wind protection barrier with him. When Terence appeared, the wind and snow that filled the sky rushed towards him. Han Jin made a hand seal, and the flying sword flashed. It surpassed the fluttering snowflakes and shot straight towards Terence. Terence waved his magic staff, and a huge ice ball appeared out of thin air, meeting the flying sword head-on. The flying sword seemed to have a life of its own. It suddenly dipped down, brushing past the ice ball and shooting along the ground. To Morrison's and the others, This was only a new type of magic released by Hanjin. They couldn't experience the power of the flying sword. However, Terence, who was in the middle of it, knew his own difficulties. At the very least, the unpredictable and sudden speed of the flying sword made him feel a great deal of pressure. The magic staff in Terence's hand slammed down, and a ring of ice spread out in all directions with him as the center. The flying sword nimbly raised its head and pierced upwards diagonally, causing the mist-like ice waves to hit nothing but air. In the next moment, the flying sword flashed behind Terence. Terence wanted to lock onto the flying sword with his gaze, but it was too late. "Hosersai, help me!" Terence yelled, and then released a spell. His body was firmly sealed in layers of ice. Icebound, also known as Ice Coffin, was originally a spell used to store some rare items. The effect of Icebound could last for a long time. The ice was very solid and would not melt even if it was exposed to the sun for a long time. However, it was not very useful in a real battle. Terence used Icebound to protect himself, which was a classic example of applying what he learned in a practical way. However, on the other hand, it also proved his helplessness. The magic attacks that he was good at could not touch the flying sword at all. Even the ice wall could not protect him. Ice armor was even more unreliable. If he wanted to release other spells, he would not have the time to recite the incantation. The most important thing now was to stay alive, at least until the cooldown of the teleportation spell was over. The archer named Hosersai was stunned. She only woke up when she heard Terence's yell. She pulled her longbow and aimed at Hanjin. A wooden figure appeared in front of Hanjin, blocking Hosersai's sight. Morrison's had already rushed out like a fierce tiger. Hosersai suddenly sensed something. She shot an arrow randomly and then retreated as fast as she could. At the same time, Leger appeared beside her. He tried to stab her with his shining dagger, but it hit nothing. Leger was severely injured. His speed and strength were greatly reduced. Otherwise, Hosersai would not have been able to escape from his attack range so easily. The flying sword floated in the air and retreated bit by bit. Terence, who was trapped in the ice coffin, looked at the flying sword nervously. Of course, he would not completely seal himself. This was a spell release technique. Wait a little longer. Terence roared in his heart. Just a little longer, and he would be able to release teleportation again. Unfortunately, Hanjin could not afford to wait. He was like a burning candle. Every movement of the flying sword was burning his life force. A dazzling light appeared on the flying sword. Then, a stream of light hit the ice coffin with great force. With a loud bang, the ice coffin was shattered into countless crystal fragments. The fragments shot out in all directions and formed a dazzling firework that covered an area of dozens of square meters. Terence's eyes dimmed. There was a bloody hole in his chest that was thicker than the rim of a bowl. Then, his body swayed and gradually fell to the ground. Hanjin performed another spell. The flying sword nodded lightly in the air. Then it flew past Leger and Morrison's and headed straight for Hosersai. Hosersai was scared out of her wits. She screamed and ran straight into the forest. However, it was impossible for her to race against the flying sword with her legs. No matter how powerful an archer was, she could not turn herself into a stream of light. With a shrill sound, the flying sword pierced the back of Hosersai's head. Hosersai used all her strength to jump to one side. The flying sword missed its target. Then, Hanjin performed another spell. The flying sword turned into a shadow and shot towards Hosersai's neck. Hosersai tried her best to dodge the flying sword. She was in a panic and bumped into an ancient tree. However, Leger and Morrison's who were chasing after her couldn't see her rolling pupils. Hosersai waited for a while. When the flying sword was about to hit her, she suddenly leaned to one side. The flying sword brushed past her neck and hit the ancient tree. The proud smile on Hosersai's face became stiff again. She saw a flash of sword light coming from behind the tree. The thick ancient tree couldn't stop the flying sword at all. Hosersai screamed again. She rolled and crawled to the side. Hanjin wouldn't show mercy to his enemy, just because she had turned into a reptile. The flying sword paused in the air and then shot toward Hosersai's back. No one paid attention to Han Jin. His face turned from red to pale, and then from pale to livid. Now, his cheeks were as dark as a dead man's. Compared with the beginning, the speed of the flying sword had slowed down a lot. Hosersai turned over and jumped up. Once again, the flying sword missed its target. Most of the sword blade had sunk into the ground. Hosersai suddenly swung her longbow and hit the flying sword heavily. Han Jin in the distance shook. A wisp of blood oozed out from the corner of his mouth. Hosersai hit the flying sword again. With a crack, her longbow was broken. Fortunately, she wasn't holding Morrison's huge sword. Otherwise, Han Jin would have been killed on the spot. The flying sword trembled violently. Hosersai was so anxious that she stretched out her foot and stepped on the flying sword. Han Jin shouted in a low voice and changed several hand gestures. The flying sword suddenly retreated from the soil. A fountain of blood gushed out from the wound on the Hydra's back, reaching a height of more than 10 meters. The wound on the Hydra's back had turned into a bottomless bloody hole that was several meters wide. The Hydra let out a painful roar and struggled with all its might. However, Han Jin couldn't see or hear any of this. His legs sank and he knelt on the ground. Then he softly lay there. Raphael. Morrison's cried out in surprise and joy. However, when he picked up Han Jin and saw Han Jin's lifeless face, his voice suddenly began to tremble. He sounded like a beast wailing. Raphael. Dragon's blood. Sunir's mind flashed. She was the only one here who knew Han Jin's secret. She was also the only one who could think of a way. Sunir screamed, "Let him drink the dragon's blood. Quickly." "What?" Sasu was stunned. "Quickly," Sunir anxiously cried out. Then, her head and body dropped down. Chapter 161. It was an endless darkness. It was extremely quiet and cold, but Han Jin could not feel anything. The last attack was to perish together with the Hydra. When the flying sword broke, his consciousness began to drift away. He could only silently sink into the darkness. Suddenly, a small flame lit up on the dark plains. The flame was very dim, like a small candle. Compared to the endless darkness, it was insignificant. However, the flame continued to burn stubbornly. The flames grew bigger and bigger until it became a bonfire floating in the air. Perhaps it was because he felt a trace of warmth, or because the flame was too bright in the darkness. Han Jin's consciousness stopped sinking. He regained a little consciousness. The flame seemed to have a life of its own. It kept growing and expanding. After an unknown amount of time, the flame had spread from a lake of fire to an endless sea of fire. The darkness that once dominated the world had long been expelled. The bone-chilling cold had nowhere to hide in the flame. Although he could not hear any sound, he could feel the roar of the flame. The dancing sea of fire was extremely vast. No matter where Han Jin looked, he could not see the end of the sea of fire. Han Jin suddenly had a very strange feeling. It was as if there were two of him. One of him was far away, silently observing the burning world. The other was a speck of dust in the sea of fire. As soon as this feeling appeared, a huge suction force sucked the speck of dust out of the sea of fire and threw it toward his other self, who was extremely far away. When the two of them merged with each other, Han Jin felt a burst of light in front of his eyes, and all his senses came back. He could feel the soreness in his body, and even hear the whispers of people around him. Han Jin suddenly understood. The endless sea of fire was actually the fire in his dantian. It was also the fire of life. You still want to give it to him? Is that enough? Han Jin heard Sasua's voice. It's not like you don't know how much Raphael eats, Morrison's replied. Moxink replied, I'm sure he can eat the whole dragon if he wants to. Do you believe me? Well, Cessation looked back at the young dragon, which was as huge as a hill. Aren't you exaggerating? Exaggerating? Why didn't you say that when Raphael ate the earth bear? As soon as he finished speaking, Han Jin felt someone pry open his mouth. Then, a fishy liquid poured in. Han Jin subconsciously wanted to spit it out, but his body muscles did not listen to him. He could not even open his eyelids, let alone his throat and tongue. However, his body seemed to be in great need of those smelly things. His throat wriggled a few times, and he swallowed all the liquid. Han Jin had a creepy feeling. What was going on? He was supposed to spit it out. Look, Morrison's was still prying Han Jin's mouth open. Raphael drank it all. He drank more than 20 cups, right? Sassu smiled bitterly. I'm afraid something will happen. What will happen? Morrison's said with disdain. Sassu, let me ask you, who in this world will not harm Raphael? Neither of us would harm Raphael, because we are friends, aren't we? Why are you in such a hurry to flaunt yourself? Morrison said, I'm asking who will not harm Raphael. Stillberg. Sassu replied, I could see that even if Raphael asked him to die immediately, he would not hesitate. You? Morrison said angrily. Are you purposely arguing with me? Then who do you think it is? Sunir, Morrison said. You're asking who will not harm Raphael. Sunir only likes Raphael. Compared to Stillberg. Go away. I'm not talking to you anymore. Morrison said angrily. Then, he pried open Han Jin's mouth. Han Jin did not have time to analyze what Morrison's had given him. Although he could not control his body, he could feel the changes in his body. Heat. Unbearable heat. What he drank was not liquid, but lava. Dragons were top-tier magical beasts, after all. The energy contained in their bodies was frighteningly large. The energy of a dragon crystal was calculated in terms of tai. 10,000 xian was 1 tai, and 10,000 jia was 1 xian. Han Jin's energy was only close to 1,000 jia. The difference between the former and the latter was like heaven and earth. Han Jin desperately wanted to open his mouth, hoping to expel some of the unbearable heat. Unfortunately, this was only wishful thinking. His dantian could no longer contain the heat. Waves of heat were spreading to his limbs and bones. Then, there was a knife-like pain. Every inch of his skin and every strand of his blood vessels were undergoing a severe test. It was not a big deal if he only felt pain in one place, but from his hair to his toes, every part of his body was in extreme pain. How was this different from death by 1,000 cuts? Just as Han Jin was trying to endure the pain, he suddenly heard Morrison say, You, go get some more dragon blood. Han Jin almost broke down. If his soul could break down, he wanted to shout loudly, no more, but he could not shout anything. The next moment, his mouth was forced open again, and mouthfuls of damned dragon blood flowed down his throat. Han Jin felt as if his entire body was burning. The pain was as if there was some kind of power constantly crushing his skin and flesh. In fact, his will was very strong, but at this moment, he wanted to beg for mercy. He really wanted to beg for mercy. What is that? Sassu suddenly said in surprise. Steam had already risen from Han Jin's body. His limbs, chest, and cheeks were all trembling uncontrollably. There's a reaction. Morrison's University was delighted. Quick, dragon blood. Are you sure you want to give it to Raphael? Sassu asked hesitantly. Isn't there a reaction now? It proves that we're right. Han Jin could no longer hear what Morrison's and Sassu were saying. He saw the boundless sea of fire again. He did not know if the range of the sea of fire had increased because he could not find the end of the sea of fire. But the tongue of fire had turned bright gold. It was pure and shining, as if it was real. Outside Han Jin's body, Morrison's was immersed in joy and drank cup after cup of dragon blood. He did not understand what dragon blood meant to Han Jin. With every cup of dragon blood he drank, Han Jin's vital fire burned brighter. In that strange world, the tongues of fire had almost reached the sky and extended down to the bottomless abyss. In the end, countless tongues of fire disappeared at the same time. Because every inch of space was filled with fire, there was no room for the tongues of fire to dance. Naturally, the tongues of fire no longer existed. That young dragon was the descendant of a superior gold dragon. It came to the Terasham Mountains for special reasons and invaded the Hydra's territory. That was why it started a fight to the death. The dragon blood contained a huge amount of magic power. Although it could not be compared to the dragon crystal, it was already too much for Han Jin to bear. However, this kind of magic power dissipated easily. When the time came, it could only be used as an alchemy material. Many people knew that dragon blood contained magic power. It was just that those who had the ability to kill dragons were too lazy to collect dragon blood. What attracted their attention was the dragon crystal, dragon scales, and dragon bones. These things were far more valuable than dragon blood. But for Han Jin, who was equivalent to an intermediate professional, dragon blood was the most important thing. If there was no accident, Han Jin would not be able to taste the dragon blood. He did not have the habit of drinking blood. Sunir and Sasu, who knew this common sense, would only focus on the dragon crystal, dragon scales, and dragon bones. Similarly, they would not remind Han Jin. To be able to drink the dragon blood before the magic power dissipated, this was Han Jin's great fortune. However, at this moment, Han Jin definitely did not feel lucky. He was still struggling in pain. The golden light became denser and denser, filling every corner. In the beginning, his consciousness could fly freely in his life, see, and pass through every flame. However, as the light became more and more clear, the movements of his consciousness became slower and slower. In the end, he could not even move. Then, he had a feeling of suffocation. After a long time, he did not know how much dragon blood the damn Morrisons drank. With a boom, a dull explosion sounded in Han Jin's life sea. The crystal-like light was shattered into pieces. Then, all the light collapsed in the same place. Han Jin's consciousness could not stay in the life sea any longer and was violently ejected. "We can't let Raphael drink anymore," Sasu shouted. "Look!" Tiny drops of blood had already seeped out of Han Jin's body. When he wiped it with his hand, it was bright red. Sasu raised his hand and glared at Morrisons. But, seeing this scene, Morrisons became uncertain. Then, he clenched his teeth and said, "One last cup. You're crazy." Sasu rushed forward to snatch the cup filled with dragon blood from Morrisons' hand. However, another hand suddenly reached out from the side and grabbed the cup first. "Raphael, you're awake," Morrisons University shouted. Han Jin opened his eyes and looked at Morrisons. At this moment, he should have jumped up and turned Morrisons into a pig's head. This was because he had already sworn many times when he was in extreme pain. "Raphael, how are you feeling?" Sasu also shouted. "Let me rest for a while. I'm tired." Han Jin slowly closed his eyes. He was really tired, not only his body, but also his soul. However, the burning pain in his throat reminded him that he had lost too much water. Han Jin had no choice but to open his eyes again. "Do you have water?" "Yes." Sasu hurriedly took out his water bag. "Don't you have water in your hand?" Morrisons winked and said, "Just treat it as water. Don't be afraid. You've already drunk a lot." One could defy heaven's wrath, but one could not escape from one's own sins. Morrison should never have rubbed salt on Han Jin's wounds before they healed. Han Jin's eyes suddenly lit up. Although his pupils were black, they strangely emitted two cold, golden rays. Then, Morrisons let out a strange cry. His body was lifted off the ground and flew more than 20 meters away. After landing, he rolled a few times before he could stabilize himself. Han Jin did not attack. He only grabbed Morrisons by the collar and threw him away. Although Morrisons did not release his combat aura, Han Jin's strength was immeasurable to be able to throw such a burly man so far away like a chick. Chapter 162. Raphael, how did you become so strong? Morrisons cried out. In fact, this was enough to prove the trust between them. If there was a barrier between them, the moment Han Jin grabbed Morrison's collar, Morrisons would have thought that Han Jin was trying to attack him, and would have reacted quickly. However, Morrisons did not release his Do Chi from the beginning to the end. Not only did he trust Han Jin, but he also instinctively let his guard down against Han Jin. A faint smile appeared on Han Jin's face. No one could remain calm in that kind of unbearable pain, but now that he had returned to normal, His resentment towards Morrison's had also disappeared. Han Jin had never been a calculative person, and he knew very well that if it weren't for Morrison's, he would never have been able to cultivate the art of alchemy. Looking at the cup filled with blood in his hand, Han Jin raised his hand and poured the dragon's blood into his mouth. At this moment, the dragon's blood was no longer as unbearably hot as before. It was only left with a warm feeling. Raphael, do you know that you look like a barbarian right now? Morrison's giggled as he came over. At this moment, a cry of surprise came from the other side. Han Jin turned his head and saw Sunir, who was lying on the blue stone, coughing violently. Every time she coughed, she would spit out a mouthful of blood. The mask on her face was already crooked, but the deacon in charge of taking care of the injured did not dare to take the mask off. Sunir, Sasu exclaimed. Then he saw Han Jin cross the distance of more than 10 meters at an astonishing speed and quietly stood beside Sunir. After the battle, Morrison's used his sword to cut off the arrows and carried Sunir here. One of the deacons happened to have 2 Holy Spirit blessing scrolls. The Holy Spirit blessing scrolls could not heal injuries, but could only prevent them from worsening. The scrolls would last for about 3 days. The problem was that their scrolls had been destroyed. Not to mention 3 days. Even if they had 30 days, they would not be able to return to isolated Cliff City. There was no way they could ask for help. Therefore, the young magicians all looked worried. When they saw that Han Jin had woken up from his coma, they did not look happy at all. It was not that they were heartless. Except for Sunir, no one knew what kind of price Han Jin had paid. Morrison's and Sasu only had a vague idea. Han Jin silently looked at the arrow stuck under Sunir's shoulder. Although this arrow did not have any magic power, the craftsmanship was very vicious. The shaft of the arrow was covered with long and short barbs. No matter if the arrow was pulled out in reverse or along the shaft, it would cause more severe injuries to the person who was hit. Raphael, how are you? How is Sunir? Morrison's asked hurriedly. She's fine, Han Jin said softly. At this moment, he realized that his voice was very hoarse. He turned his head and saw that Sasu was still holding the water bag in his hand. He reached out and took the water bag, raised his head, and drank all the water in the bag in one breath. Is she really fine? Sasu looked worried. Sunir was still coughing blood. How could she be fine with this kind of injury? Her lungs are injured. Han Jin looked up at the sky. How long have I been out? Almost half a day. That's right. Han Jin nodded. Sunir vomited blood. She has to vomit it all out. Otherwise, there will be pain in the future. Oh. Morrison's and Sasu nodded. They did not fully understand. Han Jin waited for a while. When he saw that Sunir was no longer coughing blood, he began to draw a talisman in the air. In the past, when Han Jin used talismans, Morrison's and Sasu could not see anything. They could only see a faint light when the talisman took effect. However, this time was different. Countless golden stars flew out from Han Jin's fingers and floated in the air, forming a strange talisman. Morrison's and Sasu were stunned. Han Jin waved his hand and shouted, "Go!" The talisman turned into a golden light and attached itself to the shaft of the arrow. Han Jin waited for a while. Then he reached out and grabbed the feather of the arrow, pulling it out bit by bit. If anyone else dared to do this, Morrison's would have drawn his sword and killed them. Even though he trusted Han Jin, he could not help but suck in a cold breath. Sunir, on the other hand, was very quiet. It was as if she did not feel anything. Soon, Han Jin pulled the entire arrow out. Moxing's eyes popped out. The shaft of the arrow became as soft as a snake, and the vicious barbs were swaying in the wind like a piece of soft blood-red fluff. The arrow was stained with Sunir's blood. Han Jin threw the arrow shaft to the ground. The arrow shaft twisted a few times as it landed on the ground. It was as if it was alive. The golden light quickly disappeared from the arrow shaft. When Morrison's kicked it out of curiosity, the arrow shaft had already become hard again. A wound as thick as a finger appeared under Sunir's shoulder. Fresh blood flowed out from the wound. Han Jin's hand moved quickly. Then he pressed his palm down. Countless golden lights floated down and attached themselves to Sunir's wound. One could see with the naked eye that the bleeding was slowing down. Finally, the bright light completely covered the wound. Han Jin heaved a sigh of relief. Among the 6 Ding and 6 Jia arts in the Taoist canon, the former was a spell for curing diseases, while the latter was a charm for killing people. Fortunately, he had enough interest and didn't like to overdo it, so he had learned almost everything. Although he hadn't mastered all of them, at least he had a clear impression of them. Otherwise, he wouldn't know what to do. Is it done? Sasu asked softly. Yes. Han Jin smiled. Don't worry, sir. An abrupt and hurried voice came from the side. I beg you, please help our dean. Han Jin turned his head. The one who spoke was Asa. The young magicians all surrounded him. Everyone had an anxious look on their faces, but they did not dare to be rude. Han Jin used that strange magic to kill 2 assassins. Then, he used only 1 blow to kill the Hydra. In their hearts, Han Jin was already an unfathomable powerhouse. Even though Han Jin fainted on the ground because of the exhaustion of magic, this did not affect their respect. If it were their dean, he might not be able to kill a top-tier magical beast in 1 blow. Raphael, if you can help them. Sasu interrupted. Han Jin did not know what happened. Sasu and Morrison's had already understood the process of a young magician's infighting. They all liked Asa very much. His ability was another matter. At least, Asa was a real man. Okay. Han Jin nodded. It was reasonable to say that Sasu would not overstep his authority in this kind of matter. There must be a reason, so Han Jin generously agreed. Asa was overjoyed. He glanced at the arrow shaft and walked forward. Unexpectedly, Han Jin did not follow him. Instead, he walked to the other side. The pale-faced Leger was leaning against a wooden pillar. He was lying there on his side, seemingly unconscious. It was not easy to win Han Jin's friendship. For Han Jin, this kind of thing would not change with external factors. No matter how beautiful the face or how prominent the status, it would not change him. Therefore, before treating the young dean, he had to confirm Leger's condition. Leger was very alert. When Han Jin was still 5 or 6 meters away from him, he suddenly opened his eyes. Seeing that it was Han Jin, a look of surprise and joy flashed across his face. He then tried to stand up, but his body stiffened. His eyebrows were almost knitted together. It was obvious that he had pulled on his wound. Han Jin gestured for Leger not to move with his hand. Then he walked to Leger and put the back of his hand on Leger's neck. Leger smiled weakly. Although his body did not move, his eyes were curiously looking at Han Jin. He was much more perceptive than Morrison's. He could feel that Han Jin had undergone a tremendous change. Leger's pulse was stable and strong. It did not seem like he had any hidden problems. Han Jin bent down again and carefully observed Leger's wound. Although the blood flowing out of Leger's body had dyed half of it red, the wound was not too deep. Han Jin was relieved. Is Leger okay? Sasu asked. He's fine. This guy's body is as strong as a bull. Han Jin smiled. He's like a bull. Morrison's curled his lips. No matter if it was his body, weight, or height, he was definitely the first among them. He's just a calf at most. Leger opened his mouth to retort, but then he realized that he could not speak. If he did, it would hurt his wound. He could only glare at Morrison's fiercely. Under the expectant gazes of the young magicians, Han Jin slowly walked toward Yelena. Because her injuries were too serious, no one dared to move her. She had been lying on a pile of broken branches and leaves since the beginning. At that time, Han Jin had tried his best to save her, but the thief was too fast. The sharp dagger had cut off half of her neck. As for the injury on her back, Han Jin could not see it. Fortunately, the magician's strength was limited, and the dagger did not penetrate her body. If it had been Morrison's, the thief would not have needed to stab her. Under Yelena's body was a pool of dark red blood. God knew how much blood she had lost. The flesh on her neck was a miserable white color. Her beautiful face did not change much. Her brows were slightly furrowed, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was distressed or condemning something. Han Jin also did not dare to move Yelena's body. He grabbed her wrist and listened carefully. Yelena's pulse was extremely weak and intermittent. Han Jin carefully reached out his finger and touched the flesh on her neck. From his fingertips, he could feel a dry feeling. Han Jin was shocked. At this point, Yelena should have been dead. Did you use some kind of magic? Han Jin asked. Yes, my lord. One of the deacons replied timidly. I brought 2 Holy Spirit blessing scrolls. My lord, the dean can't. Asa choked and could not continue. Somehow, they had stopped addressing Han Jin as you and had tacitly changed it to Your Excellency. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 163. Han Jin pondered for a moment and carefully cast a talisman. The talisman turned into countless golden light spots and landed on the wound on Yelena's neck, but there was no reaction at all. The skin and flesh around the wound were still deathly pale. Despair appeared on the faces of the students. If the dean died, even if they could return to the academy safely, they would have to face a storm. Han Jin stretched out his hand and gently touched the wound. This time, unlike the last time, the flesh around the wound had softened. Han Jin heaved a sigh of relief. His talisman was still effective, but Yelena's injury was too serious. The talisman he could release was far from being able to revive a dead person. It could only improve Yelena's condition bit by bit. In fact, Han Jin knew very well that what Yelena needed most now was a blood transfusion. For a normal person, even if they were not injured, drawing so much blood with a needle would bring them to the brink of death. No matter which world one was in, blood was incomparably important to living beings. Even if Yelena was a super-level master, she could not escape this law. However, this idea was absolutely not feasible at the moment. Whether their blood types matched was a big problem. Han Jin sighed helplessly. This was somewhat ridiculous. A super-level master bleeding to death? Sir, how is it? Is there a way? Asa asked eagerly. Han Jin smiled. He did not lack countermeasures. The key was who would bear the risk. Was it worth it to use spiritual energy and release a high-level Taoist spell? Cultivation was about seizing the fortune of heaven and earth and invading the mystery of all things. The word seize and the word invade were enough to prove the essence of cultivation. If one followed it, one would be mortal. If one went against it, one would become an immortal. Cultivation was going against the heavens. Saving Yelena, who was on the brink of death, was just another heaven-defying act. If it was Morrison's or Sassu who were injured, he would have already released the talisman. There was nothing to think about. But now he had to think clearly about the cause and effect. There is a way, but it is dangerous, Han Jin replied. What kind of danger? What are the chances of success? Ace's eyes lit up when he heard Han Jin say that there was a way. One side is life, the other side is death. The chances of success are about 50%. Han Jin did not tell the truth. In fact, he was at least 70% sure. However, for Yelena to step into the realm of a top-level master at such a young age, in addition to her own talent, she had countless people's blood, sweat, and tears. How could there be no power behind her? So he had to first push the blame. 50% chance of success. Asa was excited. Then what are we waiting for? Sir Dean's injuries are too severe. He might not be able to hold on for much longer. Let's quickly begin. Asa was so excited that he did not realize that his words were simply commanding Han Jin. Morrison's and Sassu frowned and looked at Han Jin worriedly. They had all experienced Han Jin's temper. He was very good to his own people, but if an outsider showed any disrespect, his face would change faster than flipping a book. The chances of success are only 50%. Are you sure you want to start? Han Jin asked again. Let's start. Ace's face showed a trace of determination. The current situation was very clear. If Han Jin did not help, Yelena would definitely die after 3 days when the effect of the blessing of the Holy Spirit wore off. It was better to let Han Jin treat her. At least there was still a 50% chance of success. What do you all think? Han Jin looked at the other magicians. At this time, a few of the quick-witted students reacted, but their reactions were different. Some quietly took a few steps back, while others stood still and pretended to be stupid. However, more people stood beside Asa and said firmly, "Let's start, sir." Okay. Han Jin's tone was short but powerful. He then began to mobilize the spiritual energy in his body. His fingers danced in the air, drawing out a series of obscure runes. The casting time this time was longer than any of Han Jin's previous spells. This was because he was casting a high-grade Taoist spell, the supreme soul-sealing spell. Even if the soul of the victim was in a state of dissipation, he had the ability to recover the soul and seal it in the victim's body. Han Jin had just drunk the dragon's blood, and his body was full of energy. That was why he dared to take the risk. If it was before yesterday, he wouldn't even dare to think about it. Perhaps the energy in his body would be exhausted before the charm was formed. After more than half an hour, Han Jin's forehead was sweating. At this time, the spell was finally formed. Han Jin made a hand sign and shouted, "Go!" The condensed talismans in the air were all scattered by the hand sign. They turned into countless light rain and splashed in all directions, sprinkling between the branches and the grass. However, they did not disappear. Instead, they kept rolling and dancing. Ancient trees, shrubs, grasses, and even moss. All the green vegetation withered at a speed that could be seen with the naked eye. Countless light spots continued to dance in the forest, jumping from one branch to another, drilling from one patch of grass to another. Wherever the happy light spots flew to, the living beings there would begin to wither. The range became wider and wider, and in the end, everything within 100 meters became yellow and withered. The supreme, soul-sealing spell could be said to be the most vivid interpretation of the word seize. For cultivators, except for some rules that they had to abide by, they never had too many scruples. A ginseng spirit that had cultivated for thousands of years already had the ability to communicate with other life forms. Or it was already a real life. Would a cultivator let it go just because the ginseng spirit had cultivated a magical power? Absolutely not. A wild fox that swallowed and spat out demon cores under the moonlight. Even if it had never done anything bad and just hid in a corner to cultivate, what would a cultivator do if they encountered it? Kill it and seize the demon core. In fact, cultivators were bandits who went against the heavens and earth. They used all means to achieve their dream of immortality. Therefore, they would not be pretentious. They would seize what they should seize and occupy what they should occupy. What's more, completely relying on one's own Jin Yuan to save a dying person would cause a lot of damage to oneself. It was not easy to cultivate to this step, and no one was willing to retreat. Naturally, no one would create a Tao technique that would harm oneself to benefit others. Attracting heavenly lightning, borrowing divine weapons, and so on were all tricks. Morrisons and the others stared blankly at the changes in the forest. They could not understand why those soft, warm, and happy light spots were like deadly toxins. Wherever they went, the plants there would quickly wither. Could this kind of magic save people? Han Jin felt that it was about time. He made another hand sign and shouted, "Rise!" The hand sign exploded in midair. Countless light spots flew up like birds returning to the forest. They condensed into a huge ball of light and then began to sprinkle down. Han Jin was a very handsome young man. There was almost no fault in his appearance. His smile always gave people a warm feeling, which should be very attractive to girls. Unfortunately, whether it was Qi Li, Sunir, Yin, or Yelena, or the few female sorcerers and deacons, after seeing Han Jin for the first time, they quickly turned their attention to other places. This was because Han Jin's temperament was too weak. In this chaotic world, weak men were not qualified to be the center of attention. Now, Han Jin had become a different person. Although his appearance was the same as before, his eyes opened and closed like lightning, and there was a sharpness that made people not dare to look directly at him. The scale of the magic he was releasing now was huge and imposing. When the countless light spots gathered together, the scene was very spectacular. The light spots sprinkled down one after another. Hanjin stood in the rain of light and kept making hand signs. His long robe fluttered, making him look like an immortal. Not to mention that he was already very handsome, and with the countless light spots as a foil, he looked extremely handsome. The few female sorcerers were so stunned that they almost forgot about the dying Dean. With each drop of light, Yelena's face gained a bit of color. When the rain of light stopped, if it wasn't for the ugly wound on her neck, Yelena would look full of vitality and even healthier than when she wasn't injured. Everyone's expression changed. Looking at the scale of the magic and its effect, some people even thought that Hanjin had released an unknown forbidden spell. But the question was, why couldn't they feel any magic waves? Hanjin sighed softly and bent down again to grab Yelena's wrist. Her pulse was still very weak, but it was much steadier. At least there was a certain rhythm. My lord, how is it? Asa asked timidly. Although he could see the effect, he still hoped to get a definite and clear answer. She will wake up by herself tomorrow, but during this time, you have to take care of her carefully. For example, you should move her to a clean place and cover her with more things. The fog in the forest is too heavy at night. I understand, my lord, Asa replied in a moaning tone. The group of young magicians couldn't help but cheer, and one of them, a deacon, rushed toward Hanjin. Hanjin raised his eyebrows, and his eyes flashed with divine light. The deacon suddenly froze, holding a handkerchief in her hand. She didn't know whether she should continue to walk over or retreat. Hanjin finally understood what she meant. He reached out to take the handkerchief and smiled. Thank you. Raphael, are you okay? Sasu asked anxiously. He was now very regretful. If he had known that Hanjin would be forced to release such a large-scale magic, he would not have persuaded Hanjin to save her. Hanjin was just about to say that he was fine, but his tone suddenly changed. I will be fine after a few days of rest. Thank you, my lord. Thank you. Asa bowed deeply to Hanjin. Thank you so much. The other magicians also bowed to Hanjin, their faces full of gratitude that they didn't know how to express. Hanjin smiled and waved his hand. He felt a little strange. In fact, it felt good to save someone. Chapter 164. In the morning, Sunir woke up from her coma. When she opened her eyes, she saw a familiar silhouette. She couldn't help but think of the heart-wrenching scene. That bright and determined smile, that stubborn and determined figure filled with fighting spirit. Sunir suddenly realized that it would be difficult for anyone else to enter her heart. For some things, meeting the right person was enough. How are you feeling? Does it still hurt? Hanjin suddenly turned his head. Although Sunir didn't make any sound, he could still feel the change. Hanjin's voice was a little unclear. His mouth was stuffed with food, and his mouth was covered in oil. He looked a little funny, but no one would laugh. Hanjin's aura had changed drastically. At this moment, his expression was very calm. After all, he was eating and not fighting. However, when Hanjin opened and closed his eyes, Sunir could clearly see a kind of sharpness. In other words, it was a kind of power that was formed by the combination of confidence and strength. This was something that Hanjin had always lacked. It doesn't hurt anymore. Sunir shook her head. Then she tried to open her eyes and looked at Hanjin from head to toe. You're fine? Sunir's voice was full of surprise. This guy is very lucky. How could anything happen to him? Morrison's voice came from outside the straw hut. Before Sunir could say anything, Morrison stuck his head into the straw hut. The key is that I'm here. If I didn't give him so much dragon blood, he probably wouldn't have woken up until now. Is that so? Sunir asked doubtfully. How can you not believe me? Morrison's was anxious. He squeezed into the straw hut. The small space suddenly became crowded with him. If you don't believe me, you can ask Raphael. See if I'm telling the truth. Morrison's was happy that he had saved Hanjin for the whole night. It wasn't easy for him to find a chance to show off, but Sunir still didn't believe him. This made Morrison's very depressed. It's true. Hanjin nodded. He'd give me a lot of dragon blood. Sunir looked at Morrison's with a much gentler gaze. She even smiled at Morrison's for the first time. Morrison's was stunned. When Hanjin carried Sunir into the straw hut yesterday, he had already taken off her mask, but Sunir didn't notice it. Now, her smile was so beautiful that even Morrison's, who had a strong immunity to it, was stunned. Sunir suddenly realized that something was wrong. She touched her face, but her face suddenly turned pale. Her wound had been carefully bandaged, and the soft armor on her body was very messy. Obviously, the person who bandaged her wound was not familiar with how to dress a woman. At least, he wasn't familiar with soft armor. Ahem. Hanjin coughed dryly. Morrison's, don't you think it's too crowded here? He saw the change in Sunir's expression and knew that he needed an explanation. It is a little crowded. Morrison's looked up at the straw hut. I should have made this hut bigger yesterday. Hanjin put down the piece of meat helplessly and pointed outside. He admired Morrison's ability to make jokes, but that didn't mean that he had to be patient. Sasu, Raphael asked you to come in. Morrison's shouted at the top of his lungs. There was no other way. No matter if it was an enemy or a friend, they had to be reasonable first. If they couldn't be reasoned with, they could only fight with their fists. It was the same for friends. Hanjin reached out to grab Morrison's, but Morrison's was already on guard against Hanjin. As soon as Hanjin moved, Morrison's moved as well. With a whoosh, he went out of the hut. Hanjin shook his head. He really couldn't understand Morrison's way of thinking. Did he think that he could stay here by pretending to be stupid? My wound. Who bandaged it for me? Sunir asked in a low voice. It was me. Hanjin's expression was very natural. Who else? Just me. Hanjin smiled. There are some things that I won't share with anyone. No one. You? Sunir was embarrassed. Hanjin actually used the word share. It was obvious that he was flirting with her. At this moment, Morrison's voice came from outside. Sunir, you have to take care of him. This guy, after drinking the dragon's blood, his violent tendencies have become more and more serious. What are you guys doing? Sasua's voice interrupted. Morrison's, Raphael called for me? Yes, hurry up and go in. Morrison's replied in a low, muffled voice. In fact, he had a habit. Every time he spoke in a low, muffled voice, his expression would become very honest. Unfortunately, Sasu didn't see through this habit. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. It was obvious that Sasu was walking towards them. Hanjin couldn't help but rub his forehead. He once again had the thought of beating Morrison's up. What would he do? Tell Sasu not to come in? If that was the case, it would only make people's imaginations run wild. Sasu's hand was already on the straw hut when Leger's voice suddenly sounded. If it were me, I wouldn't go in. Why? Because there are only two of them inside. As for who it is, I don't think I need to say it, right? Sasu was stunned for a moment. Were you eavesdropping on their conversation? Sasu, Leger was furious. I was kind enough to warn you. How dare you betray me? Ha! You deserve it. Morrison's gloated. Morrison's, you heartless bastard. Sasu was a little embarrassed because he had unintentionally betrayed Leger. He could only vent his anger on Morrison's. Then, a wave of magic appeared. Aya, you still dare to use magic? Morrison shouted. Hanjin and Sunir looked at each other. After the commotion, all their emotions were gone. Sunir paused for a moment, then changed the topic. The dragon's blood, is it useful to you? Very useful. Hanjin suddenly sighed. I wanted to store the dragon's blood. But who knew the magic in the dragon's blood has disappeared? Yes. Hanjin nodded. That's common sense. I'll remember it. I won't make the same mistake in the future. Sunir paused. Does that mean the magic crystals? Hanjin whispered. No, the dragon's blood is something between a magic crystal and food. If it was a magic crystal, I would have died a long time ago. Oh, Sunir was disappointed. She thought that Hanjin would be able to absorb any magic crystal, but then she became happy again. The dragon's blood contains a lot of energy, right? Of course, it's more than the previous ones combined. Hanjin replied with a smile. Sunir, it seems like you're more anxious than I am. Sunir was angry and embarrassed. She was usually very straightforward, but she had no experience in this kind of thing. She looked at Hanjin with hatred. After a while, she finally said something irrelevant. Can you help me out for a walk? Hanjin thought for a moment and nodded. He released a talisman and put it on Sunir. Then he bent down and hugged Sunir. Sunir was very surprised. She wanted to push Hanjin away, but she also wanted to protect herself. Her white and slender hands were very busy, but Hanjin's movements were very proper. He just gently hugged Sunir, helped her stand, and looked at Sunir with a funny expression. Sunir didn't dare to look at Hanjin. She quietly pointed at the mask on the ground. Hanjin hurriedly picked it up and handed it to Sunir. After putting on the mask, Sunir calmed down a lot. She steadied her breathing and then walked out of the straw hut with Hanjin's help. At this moment, Yelena had also woken up. Her students were excitedly surrounding her and asking about her injuries. Hanjin couldn't help but frown. He helped Sunir walk over and said, "Let her rest for a while. Try not to let her talk." Seeing Hanjin coming over, the magicians immediately made way for him. They all looked at Hanjin with heartfelt gratitude. Hanjin not only saved Yelena, but also their lives. If anything happened to Yelena, none of them would have a good ending. Yelena looked at Hanjin with a complicated expression. She had always been high and mighty since she was a child. She had never experienced such a situation. If she had been saved by a super-grade master, she would have felt better. But now she was saved by a few mercenaries she didn't think highly of. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Hanjin bent down and carefully looked at the wound on Yelena's neck. There was a trace of blood around the wound, and it was no longer deathly pale. He then reached out to touch her wrist. Unexpectedly, Yelena moved her arm to the side and stared at Hanjin in surprise. "Dean, Master Raphael has to touch it for a while before casting a spell," Asa hurriedly explained. Hanjin didn't know what to say. This explanation was too ambiguous. "Oh?" Yelena was stunned. Then, she took the initiative to give her hand to Hanjin. On the one hand, she wasn't a pretentious person. On the other hand, she also wanted to learn about different and novel spells. Ever since she woke up, she had heard too much from the students. She was really curious. Hanjin held Yelena's wrist and listened for a moment. Then, he released a talisman. When the golden light fell on Yelena's body, a bone-deep coolness enveloped her body. "What kind of spell is this?" Yelena stared at Hanjin with her eyes wide open. She could feel that her injury was getting better, and she didn't feel weak anymore. If all of this was caused by Hanjin's spell, then it could only be said that this spell was too amazing. After doing all this, Hanjin supported Sunir and said, "Your injury has stabilized, but try not to move for the next few days. You can leave when your injury is better." Although Hanjin was supporting Sunir, in Yelena's eyes, it was Sunir who was supporting Hanjin. She subconsciously thought that Hanjin had spent a lot of effort to heal her and couldn't even stand properly. "Thank you," Yelena said bitterly after a while, as if she had exhausted all her strength. If the old guys in the capital of elements had heard Yelena's words, they would have been shocked. After all, even the person who gave her the magic wand had never heard of this word. Chapter 165. Human adaptability was very strong. For example, if a person ran to the toilet, he would feel that the smell was bad at first, but after a while, he would find that he could no longer smell anything. This was also a sign of adaptability. In the beginning, young magicians thought that the Teresham Mountains were too scary. They would complain about the slightest trouble. However, after a while, they gradually got used to the life here and mastered many things that they could not learn in school. When a gale wolf appeared in front of you, the first thing to do was not to attack, but to release a defensive magic shield and be careful of your back. Gale wolves would never hunt alone. Their most common trick was to let one wolf attract the attention of the enemy, and the other members of the wolf pack would attack from the back or sides. If he was unfortunate enough to encounter a magical beast of the 8th level or above, such as an earthen bear, spiky tiger, and so on, He must not lose his head out of fear, especially when he was alone. Losing his head out of fear would only cause the disaster to descend even faster. Escaping was the only option, but he couldn't just run around. First, he had to control himself, remain silent, face the magical beasts, and slowly retreat. Magical beasts were different from humans. The reason they started killing was to fill their stomachs. When they were full, they didn't want to attack anyone, unless the other party invaded their territory or they felt threatened by the other party. If a magical beast pressed on step by step, or even launched an attack, you must not escape into the trees. For a magical beast of the 8th level, no matter how tough and tall the ancient tree was, it could not withstand a single blow. You should release some magic that emitted strong light and loud noise. After all, magical beasts were not as intelligent as humans, so they would have scruples. If it was to protect their territory, they would have no need to continue to attack when you had already begun to retreat. If it was to hunt, they would carefully consider whether it was worth it to be injured for a prey. They instinctively knew that if they wanted to survive in this forest, they had to maintain their full strength. Being injured was extremely dangerous. Also, when you saw something strange, you must control your curiosity. The flower that was more delicate than roses and more fragrant than lilies was actually a poisonous, man-eating flower. If something approached it, it would spray out a gray smoke. No matter if it was a human or a magical beast, as long as they breathed in the smoke, they would begin to rot from the inside and eventually turn into a pool of blood. In addition, you must not find a place to rest. There was once a female deacon who was tired and sat on a tree stump, who knew that the stump was disguised by a half-grown tree demon. If Leger had not discovered it early, even if Yelena could kill the tree demon in an instant, the deacon would have been strangled to death by the tree demon. In short, there were dangers everywhere in the Tereshah Mountains. Whether they liked it or not, they had to adapt. Otherwise, they would stay here forever. The young magicians recalled their previous life in the academy. It was like a dream. That evening, they began to get busy again. Because Yelena could not walk, they had stayed here for several days. In this small grassland, they built straw huts of different shapes, just like a barbaric tribe. Anyway, they had nothing to do. With Leger and the others around, there was no need for the young magicians to go hunting. They were full of energy and spent their time building straw huts. When Leger and the others brought back the prey, the female magicians would take over. Although they were a little clumsy, they had many tricks up their sleeves. For Leger, they only needed to roast the prey, but they had to try all kinds of cooking methods. Perhaps women were talented in this area. They even found an iron shield from somewhere, washed it clean, and turned it over to use as a big iron pot. At this moment, Han Jin was looking into the distance, lost in thought. Morrison's did not dare to provoke him, but an even bigger light bulb appeared. Somehow, Yelena had become close to Sunir. She always came over and pestered Sunir to tell her stories. Sunir often told her things that she had personally experienced. Yelena, on the other hand, had almost never walked outside since she was a child. Those magnificent stories were fatally attractive to her. "What are you looking at?" Yelena suddenly asked. She followed Han Jin's gaze and saw a cluster of tall, pale dragon bones. She couldn't help but laugh. "Are you still thinking about how to take the dragon bones away? There's no other way. Let's just bury the dragon bones here and make a mark. You can take them the next time you come back." "Why? Do you think we'll leak the secret?" "Of course not." Han Jin smiled. "I'm thinking about something else." When they first distributed the loot, Yelena and the others didn't want anything. They gave all the dragon crystals, dragon scales, and dragon horns to Han Jin and the others. Han Jin wanted a fair distribution, but Yelena insisted that Han Jin and the others deserved it. In the end, Han Jin knew that Yelena wanted to express her gratitude, so he accepted everything. A mere dragon bone was not enough for Yelena to do anything. "Then what are you thinking about?" Yelena seemed to be interested not only in Sunir's story, but also in Han Jin. She wanted to get to the bottom of it. "This place is the hinterland of the Tereshah Mountains. We've lost the space scroll. If we want to walk out of the forest on foot, it'll probably take a long time. Then let's walk slowly There's nothing to do when we get back, Yelena said lightly. You're the dean of the academy, Sunir said. I'm just an honorary dean. At most, I'm an honorary dean. Honorary dean? Then how do you bring students out for training? Sunir asked. She had been holding this question in her heart for a few days, but they weren't that close before, so she didn't dare to ask. At first, I didn't know either. Yelena sighed with melancholy. Now I understand. It's because someone wants me dead. Hanjin and Sunir looked at each other. If Yelena wanted to talk, she would continue. If she didn't want to talk, it was useless for them to continue. Forget it. Let's not talk about this. Yelena shook her head vigorously as if she was trying to get rid of something. In the past, she was always as cold as ice because she couldn't stand being harassed. However, after getting familiar with Hanjin and the others, her true nature gradually revealed itself. In fact, she was very easygoing, never pretentious, and never put on a superior attitude. By the way, I have something to ask you. Can you give me an answer? She asked. What is it? Hanjin asked. How did you eat all the dragon meat? Yelena pointed at the tall dragon bone. Do you know? A few students thought that you were a super-rank holy beast who had cast a transformation spell. They even secretly used magic detection on you. Me? A super-rank holy beast? Hanjin pointed at his nose. Yes. Yelena nodded forcefully. Who told you to eat so much? Sunir said gloatingly. Who said that? Hanjin was a little annoyed. Others could doubt his ability or his moral character, but it was too much for them to secretly check his breed. I can't tell you. Yelena smiled. Hanjin was about to say something, but at this moment, the bustling people in the camp all paused and then jumped up. The young magicians had set up countless magic sentries near the camp. As long as someone or a holy beast approached the camp, they would immediately sense it. Morrison's walked in the direction of the alarm with his sword. Leger had already activated his invisibility spell, and everyone in the camp was ready for battle. Only Hanjin and Yelena still looked relaxed. Confidence came from strength. Although she had suffered a few losses after entering the forest, it was only because she was inexperienced. If the same thing happened again, no one would be able to pose a threat to her. Yelena did not doubt the power she had in her hands. A moment later, a soldier strode out of the forest. When he saw Morrison standing there with a giant sword, he was surprised and shouted, Brother Morrisons, it's me, Saxon of the Reaper mercenary team. Do you remember me? It's you. Morrisons also recognized him. Where are your companions? They are elsewhere. The soldier took a few steps and locked his eyes on Yelena in the distance. However, he did not go past Morrisons and shouted, Excuse me, are you Dean Yelena? Yelena was stunned for a moment and nodded slightly. The soldier named Saxon heaved a long sigh of relief. I finally found you. After saying that, he flipped his wrist and a magic scroll flew out. An emerald green firework flew straight into the sky and exploded. Morrison's was slightly surprised. The smile on his face quickly disappeared and was replaced by a frosty expression. He quietly looked at the soldier and did not say a word. Seeing Morrison's expression change, the soldier named Saxon hurriedly smiled and said, I'm sorry. I was too anxious and forgot to explain. We returned to isolated Cliff City 5 days ago and met Mr. Scott of the God's Language Magic Academy. Mr. Scott issued a mission to find Dean Yelena. We happen to have some impression of Dean Yelena. Ha! At least, Dean Yelena's magic staff is the strangest magic staff I have ever seen. So, we accepted this mission. Dean Scott? Oh my God! Dean Scott came to find us. The young magicians cheered. Hanjin looked at Yelena, and she nodded slightly. She was telling Hanjin that Dean Scott was a friend and not an enemy. Morrison's expression changed very quickly. In the blink of an eye, he put on a cheeky smile again. Is the reward very high? Very high. It can even be said that we rarely accept missions with such a high reward. Saxon smiled and said, Don't worry, our captain has already tested him. Lord Scott is very worried about Dean Yelena's safety, which is why he offered such a high reward. He means you no harm. Otherwise, no matter how high the reward is, we wouldn't have accepted this mission. Morrison's was stunned and then nodded. Thank you. You're welcome. This is our principal. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.